Humans are mammals, but unlike almost every other mammal on Earth, we walk nearly naked. No fur to trap warmth, no thick coat to protect us from wind, rain, or cold nights, just exposed skin. From an evolutionary point of view, this makes no sense. Fur is not decoration. It is insulation, protection, survival. If evolution removes something, it is because keeping it became too costly, because another strategy replaced it, because something else mattered more. Other animals kept their fur because they needed it to survive. Humans survived without it, which means losing fur was not a mistake, it was a decision, a biological one. Somewhere in the past, the human body stopped prioritizing warmth, camouflage, and physical safety and began prioritizing something else: endurance, exposure, dependence. The moment humans lost their fur was the moment they accepted vulnerability as a permanent condition. Cold could reach the skin faster. Heat could escape the body faster. Injuries became visible. Weakness could no longer be hidden. And from that point forward, survival no longer depended on what the body could endure alone, but on what the species could build together. This video asks a single question. Why did humans lose their fur while other animals kept theirs? And why did that loss quietly shape everything that came after? From how we hunt, to how we live, to why humans have never stopped searching for shelter. Humans are mammals, yet unlike almost every other mammal on Earth, our bodies are nearly naked. This is not a small difference. Fur is one of the most important survival tools in the animal kingdom. It traps heat, protects skin, softens impact, reduces injury, and shields the body from the environment. In evolutionary terms, fur is not optional. It is expensive to grow, expensive to maintain, and therefore never lost without a powerful reason. When evolution removes something so useful, it is because keeping it has become more dangerous than losing it. Humans are mammals, yet our bodies stand apart in a way that cannot be ignored. Almost every mammal on Earth carries fur as a permanent layer of protection. Fur insulates against cold, shields the skin, reduces injury, and stabilizes the body against environmental stress. In evolutionary terms, fur is not a luxury. It is a costly structure, and evolution does not discard such structures without extreme pressure. When fur disappears, it is because keeping it has become more dangerous than losing it. For early humans, that danger was heat. The environment that shaped the human body was increasingly open, dry, and hot. As forests retreated and grasslands expanded, shade became scarce, and distances between resources grew larger. Survival required long periods of movement under direct sunlight. In these conditions, overheating was not a minor inconvenience. It was fatal. A body that cannot release heat efficiently loses coordination, dehydrates rapidly, and is forced to stop. Stopping too long in open terrain meant exposure, vulnerability, and death. Fur, in this context, became a liability. A fur-covered body traps heat near the skin. That trapped heat limits how long the body can remain active. Most mammals accept this limit. Their survival strategy is built around short bursts of movement followed by rest. They run, hide, cool down, and recover under insulation. Early humans could not rely on this pattern. Food was not always close. Water was not always immediate. Survival demanded continuous, low-intensity movement rather than explosive speed. To remain active under heat, the body had to change. Human physiology shifted toward heat dissipation. Sweat glands spread across the body, allowing evaporation to carry heat away. Blood flow patterns adapted to move heat from the core to the skin. Upright posture reduced direct sun exposure and increased airflow. But these adaptations only worked fully if heat could escape the surface. As long as fur remained, cooling efficiency was limited. The body would generate heat faster than it could release it. Losing fur removed that bottleneck. A largely hairless body allows sweat to evaporate directly. Air movement cools the skin efficiently. Heat escapes continuously instead of accumulating. This does not make the body stronger at rest. It makes the body functional during prolonged effort. Humans did not become faster than other animals. They became harder to stop. They could keep moving when heat forced others to slow down. This shift changed the entire logic of survival. Instead of relying on speed or strength, Humans relied on endurance. Instead of overpowering prey quickly, they could follow it patiently. Heat that crippled other animals became a weapon rather than a threat. This strategy only works if the human body remains operational while everything else overheats. Fur would have destroyed that advantage. Insulation would have ended movement too early. This explains why fur did not return later, even when humans migrated into colder regions. Once endurance under heat became central to survival, biology could not reverse course. Any return of dense fur would trap heat again and shorten activity time. Cold could be solved through behavior. Heat could not. At this point, the core answer begins to emerge. Humans did not lose their fur because they became careless or advanced. They lost it because survival demanded sustained movement in hot environments. Fur protected the body, but it also limited it. Endurance required exposure, and once exposure was accepted, the human path could not go back. Once the body accepted exposure as the price of endurance, survival stopped being something biology could handle alone. A fur-covered animal carries its protection everywhere, whether it is moving or resting. Without insulation, the body becomes extremely effective at releasing heat, but extremely dependent on conditions. Movement keeps it alive. Stopping without preparation puts it at risk. This creates a narrow operating window that shapes everything the body does. Too much effort generates heat faster than it can be released. Too little effort prolongs exposure and drains water. Survival exists in between, and staying there requires constant regulation. This is why the human nervous system became tightly linked to the skin. Sensation is not secondary. Heat, thirst, fatigue, irritation, and discomfort appear early because delay is dangerous. These signals are not failures to tolerate hardship. They are tools that allow correction before collapse. Fur would have softened those signals and delayed response. Humans lost that buffer and gained immediacy instead. Immediacy favors endurance because it prevents catastrophic overheating. This also explains why human movement patterns differ so sharply from other animals. Humans are not built for repeated explosive effort. Sprinting produces too much heat too quickly. What the body favors instead is steady pacing, small adjustments, and long durations. Walking becomes the ideal mode of travel because it generates manageable heat while allowing continuous cooling. This is not a cultural habit learned later. It is a direct expression of a body designed to shed heat rather than retain it. As a result, time itself becomes a biological variable. When to move matters as much as how far. Midday heat changes what the body can tolerate. Morning and evening extend capacity. A fur-covered animal experiences these differences less sharply because insulation stabilizes internal temperature. A human body feels them immediately. Timing becomes survival logic rather than convenience. Once this system is in place, it cannot tolerate insulation returning. Any significant regrowth of fur would trap heat, mute sensory feedback, and shorten the duration the body can remain active. The advantage that allowed humans to survive in open, hot environments would disappear. This is why evolution never reversed the loss, even when humans later entered colder climates. Instead of changing the body again, humans changed behavior. Shade replaces fur during rest. Fire replaces fur at night. Clothing replaces fur selectively, only when movement stops. Protection becomes external and adjustable rather than internal and permanent. The body remains optimized for heat dissipation at all times. This decision locks humans into exposure permanently. An exposed body is powerful while moving and vulnerable while still. That trade-off only makes sense if survival depends more on endurance than on passive safety. For early humans, it did. Food sources were spread out. Water was not guaranteed. Danger came from collapse as much as from predators. A body that could keep going under heat had an advantage nothing else could match. This is the point where the human story truly separates from every other mammal. Losing fur was not a cosmetic change. It was a structural commitment to a specific way of staying alive. From that moment forward, survival depended less on what the body carried and more on how it was managed. Endurance became the core asset. Exposure became the cost. Everything that followed, awareness, pacing, planning, cooperation, and later technology, exists because once fur was gone, The body could no longer be careless even for a moment. As exposure became permanent, the human body could no longer rely on instinct alone. Instinct works best when conditions are stable and forgiving, when insulation absorbs error and time cushions mistakes. An exposed body does not have that luxury. Small misjudgments accumulate quickly. Heat builds, water drains, fatigue deepens. Because of this, survival began to depend on anticipation rather than reaction. The body learned to act before danger peaked, instead of responding after it arrived. Drinking before thirst became severe, slowing before exhaustion, seeking shade before collapse. These behaviors were not learned later through culture. They were enforced directly by physiology. A body that waits too long fails. This pressure reshaped how humans relate to the future. The future stopped being abstract. It became something the body could feel approaching through sensation. Discomfort was no longer something to endure bravely. It was information pointing forward in time. This is why humans developed such sensitivity to early warning signals. Skin temperature, dryness of the mouth, heaviness in the muscles, changes in breathing. All of these became meaningful because they predicted what would happen next if nothing changed. Fur would have delayed these signals and made the future less urgent. Humans lost that delay. The exposed body lives slightly ahead of itself, always adjusting for what is coming rather than what has already happened. This also explains why human survival increasingly depended on consistency rather than extremes. Extreme effort produces extreme heat and rapid collapse. Consistent effort keeps the body within manageable limits. Over time, those who survived were not the strongest or the fastest, but the most regulated. Regulation here does not mean control through force. It means alignment with conditions, matching pace to temperature, matching effort to hydration, matching movement to terrain. This alignment is the hidden logic behind endurance. It is not stubbornness. It is responsiveness sustained over time. Once endurance became central, rest itself changed meaning. Rest was no longer simply stopping. Rest had to be protected. An exposed body that stops without shelter loses heat or continues to dehydrate. Rest became something to prepare for, not something that happened automatically. Shade, grouping, timing, and later tools made rest possible. This requirement pushed human survival away from solitary existence. Cooperation became protective because it allowed rest to be shared. One individual could remain alert while another recovered. Fur-covered animals can rest alone without planning. Humans could not. Exposure turned rest into a collective achievement. This collective dimension fed back into survival. Shared timing, shared pacing, and shared regulation reduced risk for everyone. Over time, this made humans unusually attentive to others' condition. A slowing companion signaled rising danger. Confusion or weakness threatened the group. Paying attention to others was not empathy in the abstract. It was risk management. An exposed body cannot ignore failure nearby because collapse spreads. This sensitivity is a direct extension of fur loss. When insulation disappears, bodies become interdependent. The loss of fur also narrowed the margin for error across days, not just moments. Overexertion today reduces capacity tomorrow. Dehydration lingers, injury compounds. A fur-covered animal can often recover under insulation, even after pushing too far. Humans cannot rely on that recovery. Choices chain forward. This chaining forces restraint across time. Endurance is preserved not by heroic effort, but by avoiding irreversible damage. This is why humans learned to value pacing, recovery, and maintenance long before formal knowledge existed. These were not cultural preferences. They were survival filters. Those who ignored them disappeared. All of this traces back to the same irreversible decision. Insulation trapped heat. Heat shortened sustained activity. Humans shed fur to remain active under hot conditions. That choice solved one problem and created another. It allowed movement to continue, but it removed passive protection. From that point on, survival depended on attention, timing, cooperation, and restraint. These traits did not make humans gentle or cautious by nature. They made humans viable. An exposed body cannot afford excess, delay, or blindness to conditions. It survives by staying responsive, staying aligned, and staying just inside the limits that fur once softened but endurance could not afford to keep. As survival became inseparable from regulation, the human body began to treat the environment as something that had to be read continuously rather than endured passively. A fur-covered animal can afford moments of inattention because insulation absorbs error and delays consequence. An exposed body cannot. Every shift in sunlight, airflow, humidity, and ground temperature alters the balance between heat production and heat loss. The same movement that is safe in one condition becomes dangerous in another. Walking under cloud cover is not the same as walking under direct sun. Moving on damp ground is not the same as moving on dry soil. These differences are not theoretical. They register immediately on the skin. Losing fur removed the filter that once softened these contrasts, forcing the body to become precise instead. Precision here does not mean perfection. It means awareness early enough to adjust before damage accumulates. This is why human attention evolved as a bodily function before it became a mental one. The nervous system monitors temperature, hydration, muscle strain, and breathing not because the body is anxious, but because it must continuously evaluate whether the current state can be sustained. This evaluation runs quietly in the background of every action. It asks whether effort matches conditions, whether pace matches heat, whether continuation remains possible without cost. Rhythm emerges naturally from this process. Regular movement produces predictable heat. Predictable heat allows predictable cooling. Irregular effort creates spikes that overwhelm regulation. Fur-covered animals tolerate irregularity because insulation smooths extremes. Humans cannot rely on that smoothing. Over time, steady pacing became safer than bursts, and familiarity became safer than novelty. This preference is not psychological comfort. It is an exposed body reducing uncertainty. Unknown conditions increase risk because the body cannot immediately predict how effort and heat will interact. Humans therefore approach novelty cautiously, testing limits rather than rushing past them. This caution is not fear-based. It is calibration-based. The loss of fur also reshaped how humans experience failure. Failure is rarely sudden. Overheating, dehydration, and exhaustion develop gradually. They announce themselves through subtle changes long before collapse. Ignoring those changes turns strain into injury. Responding to them turns strain into adjustment. This is why endurance does not reward toughness alone. Toughness delays response. Responsiveness preserves function. A fur-covered animal can afford delayed response because insulation buys time. A human body cannot. Survival favors those who listen early rather than those who endure silently. This pressure shaped how humans relate to learning. Knowledge that reduces exposure has immediate value. Knowing where shade persists, when heat peaks, or how terrain alters effort directly extends functional time. Knowledge here is not abstract advantage. It is stored regulation. Where fur once stabilized the body physically, memory stabilizes it behaviorally. Forgetting forces the body to relearn limits through strain, which is costly. This is why humans became dependent on shared knowledge. One individual's misjudgment under exposure can affect others. Sharing observations reduces collective risk. A fur-covered animal can fail alone and recover alone. Humans operate closer to thresholds. Consequences spread more easily. Cooperation therefore becomes protective rather than optional. One person notices rising heat while another pushes too hard. One slows while another recovers. These patterns are not cultural additions layered onto biology. They are direct responses to a body that no longer carries its protection internally. As these behaviors stabilized, humans occupied a narrow but powerful niche. They could remain active when heat forced others to stop, but only by staying attentive, paced, and coordinated. Losing fur did not make humans fragile. It made survival conditional on continuous adjustment, where staying alive depended less on force and more on knowing when to continue, when to slow, and when to change course before the body paid a price it could not recover from. And as this way of living settled into the body over generations, the exposed human form began to experience the world not as a background, but as a constant participant in survival where heat, light, wind, distance, and effort were never neutral factors, but active forces shaping what could be done next. And this continuous interaction slowly rewired how humans perceived safety itself, because safety was no longer something that could be carried. passively on the body, but something that emerged only when conditions were managed correctly, which meant that the body learned to associate calm, not with stillness, but with successful regulation. Those elements aligned, the nervous system relaxed not because danger disappeared, but because balance was temporarily achieved. And this association remains deeply embedded even now, which explains why humans often feel more settled after steady movement than after complete inactivity. Motion under control reassures an exposed body that regulation is functioning, while stillness without context leaves uncertainty unresolved. And this uncertainty is not fear in the emotional sense, but a lack of confirmation that conditions are being handled properly. Since a body without fur cannot rely on passive buffering, it must constantly confirm that it remains within tolerable limits. And this need for confirmation shaped how humans relate to repetition and routine, because repetition reduces unknowns and routine stabilizes feedback loops, allowing the body to predict how effort will translate into heat, how heat will translate into fatigue, and how long recovery will take. And in environments where survival depends on avoiding sudden overload, predictability becomes valuable, not as comfort, but as protection. And this preference for predictable regulation explains why humans often resist abrupt changes in rhythm, even when change promises improvement, because any disruption introduces unknown interactions between effort and exposure that the body cannot immediately calculate, and so it responds with caution rather than enthusiasm. Not because it fears novelty, but because novelty temporarily removes the regulatory map that endurance depends on. And as these patterns reinforced themselves, over time humans became increasingly oriented toward continuity rather than intensity, because intensity produces rapid heat and rapid depletion, while continuity preserves function across hours, days, and seasons. And this orientation does not diminish ambition, curiosity, but channels them through pacing and sequencing rather than force, which is why human achievement so often takes the form of long accumulation rather than single decisive moments, and why progress appears gradual even when outcomes are significant, because an exposed body cannot afford repeated collapse and must therefore distribute effort across time. And this distribution shaped how humans experience success itself, because success became less about reaching an endpoint and more about remaining capable. Afterward, a hunt was successful only if the body could still move the next day. Journey was successful only if recovery was possible afterward. And this logic persists subtly, even in modern contexts, where people judge experiences not only by what was accomplished, but by how depleted or intact they feel afterward, because the ancient body continues to evaluate outcomes through the lens of endurance rather than completion. And this evaluation feeds directly back into behavior, encouraging moderation, foresight, and maintenance rather than excess and neglect. And while these traits are often framed as moral or cultural, they originate from a simple biological reality. Once fur was lost, survival demanded a constant negotiation between movement and exposure. And that negotiation never truly ends, because every action still generates heat, every pause still carries risk, and every environment still imposes limits that must be read and respected. And as long as the human body remains exposed, it will continue to organize attention, behavior, and even satisfaction around the quiet goal of staying functional, just long enough for the next adjustment to be made and the next condition to be met, and the next moment of balance to emerge, while always remaining aware that this balance is temporary and must be recreated again through timing, restraint, and awareness, rather than assumed as a permanent state. And as this temporary balance had to be recreated over and over again, the human body slowly learned to measure life not by isolated moments, but by sequences of regulation, where each choice influenced the next, and where endurance depended on preventing small mismatches from turning into cascading failures. Because once exposure is accepted, there is no hard reset built into the body itself, and this absence of a reset mechanism forces the organism to think forward continuously, not in abstract plans, but in bodily forecasts of how long energy will last, how quickly heat will accumulate, and how soon recovery must begin. And this forecasting does not feel like conscious calculation, but like intuition, because it is carried out by systems that evolved specifically to keep an exposed body inside survivable ranges. And this is why humans often describe a sense of knowing when something is unsustainable, even if they cannot articulate why, because the body is integrating signals across time, estimating whether the current pattern can continue without cost. And when the answer is no, discomfort rises not to punish, but to redirect behavior before damage becomes irreversible. And this redirection shapes not only movement but decision-making more broadly, because choices that promise immediate reward at the expense of long-term regulation feel wrong in a way that is difficult to ignore, since the exposed body experiences future depletion as a present threat. And this sensation of threat is subtle, persistent, and cumulative rather than dramatic, which explains why humans often struggle more with chronic strain than acute danger. Because chronic strain erodes regulation quietly, while acute danger produces clear signals and clear responses. And in an endurance-based organism, clarity matters more than intensity, since clarity allows adjustment and intensity often overwhelms it. And this preference for clarity over intensity has far-reaching consequences, because it influences how humans structure effort, how they divide labor, and how they build systems that reduce unpredictable exposure, smoothing inputs across time and space. And these systems do not emerge from abstract reasoning alone, but from generations of bodies learning that unpredictability is costly when insulation is gone, and that stability is achieved not by eliminating effort, but by making effort manageable and repeatable. And as these lessons accumulate, they become embedded in habits, norms, and expectations that feel cultural, but are in fact physiological strategies, scaled up across groups, because what works for one exposed body under heat also works better for many when coordinated. And this coordination further reduces risk by distributing vigilance and allowing recovery to occur without complete withdrawal from activity. And this is why humans rarely operate as isolated units for long, because exposure makes isolation inefficient and dangerous, since no single body can monitor all variables at once, and sharing perception reduces blind spots, while sharing effort preserves endurance. And this collective regulation becomes especially important over long timescales, where fatigue, injury, and depletion cannot be avoided entirely, but can be managed if responsibility shifts fluidly between individuals. And this fluidity depends on trust, not as an abstract moral value, but as confidence that others will regulate themselves and the group appropriately. Because a single failure can propagate quickly when bodies operate close to their limits, and this is another quiet consequence of fur loss insulation once localized, failure within the individual, while exposure allows it to spread, which makes coordination not optional but essential. And as these dynamics stabilize, the human organism becomes less tolerant of chaos, not because chaos is frightening, but because it introduces unpredictable interactions between effort, heat, and recovery that the body cannot quickly resolve. And this intolerance expresses itself as a preference for order, rhythm, and continuity that persists even when material conditions improve, because the underlying body has not changed and still interprets disorder as increased exposure regardless of context. And so the exposed human body carries its evolutionary history into every environment, interpreting conditions through the same regulatory lens that once determined whether it could keep moving under the sun. And while technology can reduce immediate exposure, it cannot remove the need for regulation entirely, because the body still generates heat, still consumes energy, and still accumulates fatigue, and therefore still requires pacing awareness and recovery to remain functional. And this continuity ensures that the original trade-off made when fur was lost continues to shape experience quietly, persistently, and without resolution, as the body moves through each moment, seeking not comfort or dominance, but the simple ability to continue without crossing thresholds that once meant the end of movement, and often the end of survival. And because the body never forgets this dependence on regulation, it carries a quiet tension into every situation where effort and consequence become disconnected, which is why modern environments that remove visible effort while maintaining constant stimulation often feel strangely unsatisfying to humans, even when they are objectively safe, because the exposed body evolved to expect a relationship between what it does and how it feels afterward, and when that relationship is blurred, the nervous system continues, searching for signals that confirm regulation is actually taking place. And this search manifests as restlessness, difficulty settling, and a sense that something is incomplete. Not because danger is present, but because feedback is missing, and this absence of feedback creates a low-level alertness that never fully resolves, since the body cannot confirm that its internal state aligns with external conditions. And historically, that confirmation came from direct interaction with heat, movement, resistance, and recovery, which is why activities that restore this loop, such as steady walking, controlled exertion, or exposure to natural temperature variation, often produce calm disproportionate to their simplicity, because they re-establish the dialogue the exposed body expects, allowing the nervous system to downshift because it can once more predict how effort will translate into sensation and how sensation will resolve over time. And this predictability is the foundation of trust, not trust in the abstract, but trust that the body can manage what comes next without being surprised by sudden overload. And this trust reduces vigilance, because vigilance is only necessary when outcomes are uncertain, and this explains why humans often sleep better after physical effort, even when that effort is not extreme, because movement under control produces heat, dissipation that follows familiar patterns, allowing the body to close the regulatory loop that remained open during inactivity. And this closure signals that balance has been restored temporarily and can be recreated again tomorrow if needed. And this expectation of recreatable balance is crucial, because an exposed body cannot rely on permanent safety. It relies on repeatable processes, and these processes depend on rhythm, consistency, and gradual change rather than abrupt shifts. And when life accelerates beyond what regulation can follow, the body responds with strain, not because it is fragile, but because it evolved to operate within a narrow band where adjustment is possible, and this band was shaped by the original conditions under which fur was lost. Conditions where survival depended on staying active under heat without crossing thresholds that would end movement. And this dependency on thresholds remains embedded, even when the environment changes, because biology updates slowly, and the human body continues to interpret stress, comfort, effort, and rest through the same lens that once determined whether it could keep moving across open ground. And this continuity explains why humans often experience dissatisfaction when systems promise efficiency at the cost of regulation, because efficiency that removes adjustment leaves the body without a role, and without a role, the exposed body cannot confirm safety, since safety was never something it possessed, but something it enacted, repeatedly through pacing, attention, and correction. And so the human organism remains oriented toward processes rather than states, valuing the ability to manage conditions more than the elimination of conditions themselves. And this orientation shapes motivation, behavior, and even perception, because what feels right is not the absence of challenge, but the presence of manageable challenge that allows regulation to stay active. And when challenge disappears entirely, the system does not relax. It waits, because waiting without context once meant exposure without protection. And this ancient association persists, subtly guiding preferences toward environments and activities that keep the regulatory loop intact and legible. And as long as the human body remains exposed beneath every layer of technology, it will continue to organize experience around this quiet imperative to stay within limits, not by retreating from the world, but by engaging with it in ways that allow constant adjustment, continuity, and recovery, while never assuming that balance, once achieved, will remain without being actively maintained. Again, and as this need for active maintenance continued to shape behavior across generations, it quietly influenced how humans came to understand control itself, interaction with it within tolerable bounds. And this distinction matters, since a body that lost fur cannot overpower conditions for long, it can only negotiate with them. And this negotiation relies on constant small adjustments rather than decisive acts, which is why human competence so often appears subtle and understated rather than dramatic, because success is measured by the absence of collapse rather than the presence of triumph. And this metric of success emerges directly from an exposed physiology where the greatest achievement is simply continuing, without injury, without exhaustion, and without irreversible loss of capacity. And this orientation toward continuation, explains why humans developed such a strong sensitivity to cumulative strain. Because strain does not announce itself loudly at first. It accumulates quietly across repeated days of slight misalignment between effort and recovery. And when insulation is gone, those misalignments are not erased overnight. They linger and compound, which forces the body to treat consistency as a form of protection. And this protection is fragile because it depends on maintaining rhythms that can easily be disrupted by changes in schedule, environment, or demand. And so the exposed body becomes vigilant, not towards single threats, but toward patterns that drift slowly out of range. And this vigilance is often misread as overthinking or worry, but at its core, it is a long-horizon regulatory response that evolved to keep the body functional over extended periods of effort under heat. And this long-horizon perspective also reshaped how humans perceive reward, because rewards that encourage overextension feel hollow or even threatening when they undermine future capacity, while rewards that support recovery, stability, and continuity feel satisfying, even if they appear modest, because the body evaluates reward not only by immediate pleasure, but by its effect on the next day, the next week, and the next season. And this evaluation is automatic, embedded in physiology rather than taught explicitly, and it explains why humans often feel regret, not after failing to push hard enough, but after pushing too hard and paying the price later, since regret here is not moral judgment, but recognition that regulation was compromised unnecessarily. And this recognition feeds back into behavior, encouraging restraint, foresight, and pacing rather than repeated escalation. And as these feedback loops stabilized, they shaped how humans structured social roles, because tasks that demanded constant exertion could not be performed indefinitely by one individual, without breakdown, and so responsibility rotated, allowing recovery to occur while activity continued, and this rotation reduced exposure at the group level, even when individual exposure remained unavoidable. And this pattern of shared load distribution mirrors the same logic that governs pacing, within a single body scaled outward to multiple bodies, cooperating under the same environmental pressures. And this scaling is significant because it shows that many social structures emerge not from abstract ideals, but from the practical need to keep exposed bodies functional across time. This need persists even when conditions change, because the body still operates under the same constraints, generating heat, consuming energy, and requiring recovery, and therefore still benefiting from distributed effort, predictable rhythms, and clear signals. And when modern systems obscure these signals by separating effort from outcome, the exposed body responds with confusion rather than relief, because it cannot verify that regulation is occurring, and without verification, it cannot relax, and so the search for structure, routine, and meaningful effort continues, not as nostalgia, but as a physiological requirement carried forward from a time when losing fur meant that survival could no longer be entrusted to the body alone, but had to be enacted continuously through attention, coordination, and restraint. And this enactment remains unfinished, never resolved once and for all, because each moment presents new conditions that must be met and adjusted to again and again as the body moves forward, relying not on insulation or force, but on its capacity to notice, shift, respond early, and remain within the narrow margins that allow movement to continue without interruption or collapse. And while this capacity to notice and respond early preserved movement, it also reshaped how humans experience pressure, because pressure stopped being something that arrived suddenly and became something that accumulated gradually, through slight imbalances that were easy to ignore in the moment but costly over time. And this gradual accumulation trained the body to remain sensitive even when nothing dramatic was happening, because the most dangerous states were often the quiet ones, where regulation drifted just enough to reduce margin without triggering alarm. And this sensitivity to drift explains why humans often feel discomfort before they can identify a clear cause, since the body is detecting a trajectory rather than a single event and attempting to redirect it before it crosses a threshold. And this attempt is not conscious strategy, but embodied correction unfolding beneath awareness, as changes in posture, pace, breathing, or attention that aim to restore balance without stopping movement entirely. And this capacity for subtle correction is one of the most important outcomes of losing, Fur, because it allows an exposed body to remain functional in changing conditions without requiring full withdrawal or collapse. And as this skill refined itself over generations, it shaped how humans relate to effort, not as something to be maximized, but as something to be modulated, because effort that cannot be modulated becomes dangerous when heat cannot be trapped safely, and this modulation requires constant comparison between internal state and external demand, which turns the world into a field of variables rather than obstacles. And this framing influences perception itself because terrain, weather, distance, and time are not seen as challenges to defeat, but as factors to align with, and alignment produces flow, while misalignment produces strain. And this understanding emerges directly from an exposed physiology where success depends on maintaining compatibility between the body and its surroundings, rather than imposing will upon them. And this compatibility is temporary, always subject to change, which prevents complacency and keeps attention lightly engaged, even during routine activity, because routine itself can become risky if conditions shift unnoticed. And this light engagement differs from vigilance in that it does not exhaust the system but keeps it ready to adjust. And this readiness is what allows endurance to persist across hours and days without overwhelming fatigue. Because the body avoids large corrections by making many small ones, and this pattern carries forward into how humans experience satisfaction. Because satisfaction is often felt when adjustments work, when the body remains within limits, without struggle rather than when extremes are reached. And this satisfaction is quiet, easily overlooked but deeply regulating because it confirms that the exposed body is being managed successfully, and this confirmation reduces the need for heightened alertness, allowing attention to soften without fully disengaging. And this soft engagement is a hallmark of endurance-based living where the goal is not intensity but continuity. And continuity depends on preventing small stresses from compounding into irreversible damage. And this prevention becomes increasingly important as environments grow more complex, because complexity introduces interactions that are harder to predict and therefore harder to regulate quickly. And when prediction becomes difficult, the body responds by narrowing margins, slowing pace, and increasing reliance on familiar patterns. Not because novelty is undesirable, but because regulation requires time to recalibrate, and this recalibration is safest when changes are incremental, and this preference for incremental change persists, even when external pressures push for speed, because the exposed body prioritizes staying functional over keeping up. And this priority often creates tension between biological limits and cultural demands, but the different body consistently signals when those demands exceed what can be sustained. And these signals may be ignored temporarily, but they do not disappear because the underlying constraints remain unchanged. And as long as the human body continues to generate heat, consume energy, and require recovery, it will continue to organize experience around the same regulatory principles that once allowed it to move across open landscapes, without fur relying not on protection carried within the skin, but on the continuous ability to sense, adjust, remain just inside the limits that keep movement possible, and interruption at bay. And because interruption was once synonymous with danger, the human body developed a deep preference for continuity that still influences how effort is organized today. Because continuity allows regulation to remain active, while interruption forces abrupt transitions that can overwhelm an exposed system. And this preference explains why humans often feel unsettled when rhythms are repeatedly broken, even if each break seems minor, since each disruption requires the body to restart its regulatory process without the buffering that fur once provided. And restarting repeatedly increases uncertainty about whether balance will be restored in time. And this uncertainty keeps attention engaged longer than necessary, which gradually drains energy, not through effort itself, but through unresolved readiness. And this mechanism helps clarify why environments filled with constant alerts, sudden demands, and fragmented tasks feel exhausting even without physical strain, because they repeatedly interrupt the regulatory flow that an endurance-based body relies on to stay functional, and, when flow is broken, the body cannot smoothly adjust heat, effort, and recovery, causing small mismatches to accumulate beneath awareness. And this accumulation produces a diffuse fatigue that is difficult to attribute to any single cause, and therefore difficult to resolve quickly. And as these experiences repeat, the body learns to associate stability, not with inactivity, but with sustained, manageable engagement, where inputs and outputs remain legible and predictable. And this learning is reinforced every time continuity allows recovery to occur without collapse, confirming that the system is working as intended. And this confirmation is deeply calming because it signals that exposure is being handled effectively, even in the absence of insulation. And this is why humans often seek environments and activities that provide steady feedback rather than intense stimulation, since steady feedback allows the body to recalibrate continuously, while stimulation often overwhelms regulatory channels faster than they can respond. And this distinction becomes clearer when considering how humans respond to prolonged challenges, because challenges that escalate gradually allow adjustment, while those that spike abruptly provoke strain regardless of overall difficulty. And this sensitivity to rate of change originates from an exposed physiology where rapid shifts in heat or effort are more dangerous than high levels, sustained steadily. And as a result, the body favors slopes over cliffs, transitions over jumps, and sequences over shocks. And this preference shapes everything from movement to learning to emotional processing, because sudden emotional shifts can also disrupt regulation by altering breathing muscle, tension, and metabolic demand faster than the system can compensate. And so emotional moderation emerges not as suppression, but as pacing, ensuring that internal changes do not outstrip the body's capacity to respond. And this pacing becomes especially important in social contexts where the states of others influence one's own regulation, because an exposed body must account not only for its own effort, but for the dynamics of the group, and sudden changes in group behavior can increase exposure for everyone. And this interdependence reinforces the value of predictability, coordination, and gradual adjustment across social systems as well. And over time, these values become embedded in norms, routines, and expectations that prioritize reliability over intensity and maintenance over peaks. And while these patterns are often framed as conservative or resistant to change, they are better understood as strategies for preserving function when margins are narrow and recovery is costly. And this understanding reveals that much of what feels like human caution is actually a refined sensitivity to thresholds developed by a body that cannot afford to be surprised. And as long as the human body remains exposed beneath layers of culture and technology, it will continue to favor conditions that allow regulation to stay ahead of disruption. Because staying ahead is what once allowed movement to continue under heat, and what still allows life to proceed without breakdown when insulation is no longer there to soften the consequences of delay. And as this sensitivity to thresholds deepened, it quietly altered how humans relate to effort across an entire lifespan, because an exposed body cannot treat youth strength and age weakness as separate categories, since regulation must function at every stage. And so survival strategies favored those that preserved capacity rather than those that burned it early, which explains why humans evolved unusually long developmental periods and extended lifespans. Not because the body became slower, but because endurance as a strategy benefits from learning how to manage limits before pushing against them. And this learning requires time, repeated exposure, and gradual calibration, which allows the body to build an internal map of what it can sustain under different conditions. And this map becomes more detailed with experience, not less, because each encounter with heat, fatigue, or depletion refines prediction and improves future regulation. And this refinement does not end in adulthood, but continues as conditions change and capacities shift, requiring constant updating rather than reliance on fixed rules. And this dynamic adaptation is only necessary because insulation no longer absorbs error, and because error has lasting consequences once exposure is accepted. Their bodies far longer than most animals, monitoring signs of strain long after peak physical strength has passed, because the body remains the primary site of regulation and cannot be outsourced entirely to systems or tools. And this ongoing attentiveness reshapes identity itself, because identity becomes tied not to maximal output, but to the ability to remain capable over time and to adjust expectations without collapsing, which creates a subtle continuity between youth and age, where experience compensates for declining raw power by improving regulation, and this trade would not make sense in an insulated organism where protection remains constant, regardless of awareness, but in an exposed body awareness becomes a resource that grows rather than fades. And this growth explains why humans often value experience in roles that require sustained judgment rather than explosive action, because endurance-based living rewards those who can anticipate drift, recognize early warning signs, and adjust course before damage accumulates. And this pattern scales beyond the individual into societies where institutions that preserve continuity across generations emerge not as abstract ideals, but as mechanisms for maintaining collective regulation over long spans of time. And these institutions function best when they change gradually, allowing recalibration rather than sudden shifts that overwhelm capacity. While such gradualism is often criticized as resistance, it reflects the same biological logic that governs an exposed body moving through variable environments, because abrupt change increases uncertainty, and uncertainty increases exposure, and exposure increases risk, and this chain remains active, regardless of technological advancement, because the body itself has not changed and still responds to unpredictability with heightened vigilance and strain. And this is why periods of rapid disruption often produce widespread exhaustion, even when material conditions improve, because the rate of change exceeds the regulatory bandwidth of bodies adapted for endurance rather than shock. And this mismatch produces fatigue that cannot be resolved by rest alone, because rest addresses depletion, not disorientation. And when orientation is lost, the body remains alert even while inactive, waiting for conditions to stabilize enough to resume effective regulation. And this waiting can become prolonged in environments where change is constant, leading to a persistent sense of unease that is not tied to any single threat, but to the absence of stable reference points. And this absence is felt more acutely by an exposed body, because it lacks internal buffering and therefore depends on external regularities to guide adjustment. And when those regularities fragment, the body compensates by narrowing margins, slowing responses, and clinging to familiar patterns not out of nostalgia, but out of necessity. And this necessity continues to shape behavior, perception, and preference, quietly guiding humans toward ways of living that allow regulation to remain legible and continuous, even as circumstances evolve and as long as the human organism remains built around heat, dissipation, endurance, and exposure. It will continue to organize life around this quiet imperative to stay oriented, stay responsive, and stay capable of moving forward without interruption by managing change at a pace the body can follow and adjust to, while never assuming that stability once achieved will persist without ongoing attention and recalibration. And as this need for ongoing recalibration persisted, it subtly influenced how humans interpret meaning itself, because meaning became linked not to isolated achievements, but to patterns that could be sustained without eroding capacity. And this framing explains why activities that align effort with recovery often feel meaningful even when they lack obvious rewards, while activities that promise rapid gain but leave the body depleted feel empty afterward, since the exposed body evaluates meaning through its effect on future regulation rather than immediate outcome. And this evaluation operates below conscious reasoning, shaping preference, motivation, and satisfaction without needing explanation. And this is why humans often feel drawn to practices that appear repetitive or simple, because repetition under stable conditions allows the body to confirm that regulation is working. And confirmation is deeply reassuring to an organism that cannot rely on insulation to absorb error. And this reassurance quiets vigilance, not by eliminating uncertainty, but by demonstrating that uncertainty can be managed repeatedly. And this demonstration builds trust in process rather than in outcome, which is a crucial distinction, because outcomes are always temporary, while processes can be reenacted. And this reenactment is what allows an exposed body to continue without fear of collapse. And as this trust in process grows, it reduces the need for extremes, because extremes compress effort into short windows that increase heat accumulation and strain, time keeping variables within calculable ranges. And this distribution becomes a central organizing principle not only for movement, but for thought attention, and emotion, because all of these generate physiological demand that must be regulated, and when demand spikes abruptly, regulation lags, creating discomfort that the body associates with risk. And this association discourages sudden shifts in favor of gradual transitions, even in non-physical domains, and this continuity across domains reveals how deeply the loss of fur reshaped the human organism, since a change that began as a thermal adaptation cascaded into a general strategy for interacting with the world based on pacing, sequencing, and adjustment. And this strategy persists even when the original environmental pressures are no longer obvious, because the body still operates according to the same constraints, generating heat, requiring recovery, and responding to imbalance before it becomes damage. And this persistence explains why humans often experience relief when systems restore clear feedback loops, even if those systems demand effort, because effort with feedback is easier to regulate than ease without signals. And this preference becomes increasingly important as environments grow more abstract and mediated, because abstraction removes sensory cues that once guided adjustment, forcing the body to rely on indirect information that may arrive too late or too weakly to be useful. Not because danger is greater, but because clarity is reduced, and this heightened vigilance drains energy quietly over time, contributing to fatigue that feels disproportionate to activity and difficult to resolve through rest alone, since rest does not restore orientation. Orientation is what allows regulation to resume efficiently, and this distinction underscores why the exposed body values coherence above comfort. Because coherence allows prediction, and prediction allows adjustment, while comfort without coherence leaves the system uncertain and waiting. And this waiting is costly for an organism that evolved to keep moving under heat by staying just ahead of collapse. And as long as that organism remains the foundation of human experience, it will continue to seek conditions that make regulation visible, manageable, and repeatable, even as culture, technology, and environment continue to change. And this continuity ensures that the original trade made when fur was lost continues to echo through perception, behavior, and preference shaping how humans live, move, work, and rest, not by dictating specific actions, but by biasing the system toward ways of being that preserve the ability to continue without interruption through attention pacing and constant gentle recalibration rather than force insulation or final solutions. Shaped how humans interpret success across uncertain conditions, because success ceased to mean reaching a fixed endpoint, and instead became the ability to remain adaptable when circumstances shifted without losing functional capacity. And this orientation explains why humans often reassess goals mid-course, adjusting expectations rather than clinging rigidly to original plans, since rigidity increases the risk of mismatch between effort and condition, and mismatch under exposure leads to strain rather than progress. And this adaptive flexibility is not indecision, but a physiological safeguard developed by bodies that cannot afford prolonged misalignment, and this safeguard becomes especially visible when conditions deteriorate because the exposed body responds by narrowing focus, reducing output, and conserving resources, rather than escalating effort blindly. And this response is frequently misunderstood as weakness, even though it preserves the possibility of continuation, which is ultimately the metric that matters for an endurance-based organism. And this emphasis on continuation reshaped how humans perceive loss, because loss was not only the absence of gain, but the reduction of future capacity, and therefore losses that compromised regulation, such as injury, exhaustion, or depletion, carried greater weight than losses that merely delayed outcomes. And this weighting persists subtly, influencing choices, where people often avoid paths that promise high reward at the cost of high strain, even when those paths appear efficient on paper, because the body evaluates efficiency through sustainability rather than speed. And this evaluation is automatic, grounded in the same regulatory logic that once determined whether movement could continue under heat. And this logic extends into how humans relate to uncertainty, because uncertainty that unfolds gradually allows adjustment, while uncertainty that arrives abruptly overwhelms regulation, and so the body favors environments and strategies that reveal change early, giving time to respond. And this preference underlies the human tendency to seek forecasts, routines, and signals that reduce surprise, not because surprise is inherently bad, but because surprise compresses response time, and compressed response time increases exposure risk when insulation is absent. And this is why humans often feel calmer when they understand what is coming, even if what is coming is difficult, because understanding restores the ability to pace, effort, and prepare recovery, and preparation is the exposed body's substitute for protection. Central humans learn to externalize it into tools, schedules, and shared agreements that extend individual regulation across larger systems, allowing continuity to persist even when individual capacity fluctuates. And this externalization does not eliminate vulnerability, but distributes it, making collapse less likely by preventing all strain from concentrating in one place at one time. And this distribution mirrors the same principle that governs pacing within a single body where load is spread across muscles, time, and movement to avoid overload. And this mirroring reveals a consistent pattern from physiology to social organization driven by the same need to remain functional under exposure. And this need persists even as environments change because the body continues to generate heat, consume energy, and require recovery regardless of context, and therefore continues to benefit from strategies that keep variables within manageable ranges. And when those strategies fail or are overridden, the body signals distress not to punish, but to redirect, because redirection is what once allowed movement to continue and what still allows life to proceed without interruption. And this redirection operates continuously, shaping preference, behavior, and perception without requiring conscious explanation, because it is embedded in the systems that evolved to manage exposure when fur was lost, and as long as those systems remain active, the human organism will continue to orient toward ways of living that prioritize adaptability over fixation, continuity over intensity, and regulation over force, quietly reenacting the same survival logic that once allowed it to move across open landscapes under the sun, by staying responsive enough to adjust before conditions closed in and movement had to stop. And as this orientation toward adaptability became the default state, it gradually influenced how humans experience certainty, because certainty was never something the exposed body could possess absolutely. It was always provisional, dependent on conditions remaining within expected bounds, and this provisional quality trained the organism to remain lightly engaged, even during periods of apparent stability, since stability without confirmation was unreliable. And this is why humans often maintain a background awareness, even when nothing seems to demand attention, because the body learned long ago that conditions can change faster than insulation can respond, and that early detection is the difference between adjustment and collapse. And this background awareness does not feel like constant alarm, but like readiness that can be activated smoothly when needed, allowing the system to stay flexible without exhausting itself. And this readiness is maintained through subtle checks, posture, breathing, temperature sensation, effort that continuously inform the nervous system about whether the current pattern can continue safely. And when these checks align, the body settles not into passivity, but into confidence that regulation is holding, and this confidence supports sustained engagement rather than withdrawal. And it explains why humans often feel most at ease when actively doing something manageable rather than when completely disengaged, because engagement provides ongoing confirmation that regulation is occurring, while disengagement removes feedback and forces the system to wait without evidence, and waiting without evidence once meant exposure without protection, and so the body remains alert in those states, even if no immediate threat exists. And this alertness is not pathological. It is inherited logic, carried forward from an environment where stopping without context could be dangerous. And this logic also shapes how humans relate to risk, because risk is evaluated not only by probability of failure, but by recoverability, since an exposed body can tolerate risk that allows correction, but not risk that leads to irreversible loss of capacity. Why humans sometimes accept challenging conditions willingly, while avoiding others that appear safer, but offer no margin for adjustment, since the former preserves agency, while the latter threatens sudden collapse. And agency here means the ability to respond rather than control, because control implies dominance, while response implies dialogue. and an exposed body survives through dialogue with conditions, not domination of them. And this dialogic relationship reinforces humility toward the environment, because the body recognizes that it cannot force outcomes without cost, and that cooperation with terrain, climate, and timing yields better results than resistance. And this recognition does not weaken ambition, it refines it, channeling effort into paths that remain viable over time. And as ambition is refined, it becomes less about proving capacity and more about preserving it, which shifts motivation from display to continuity. And this shift can be seen in how humans often value resilience, reliability, and steadiness, even when they celebrate moments of peak performance, because peaks are only meaningful if the system can return from them intact. And this valuation persists, subtly influencing judgments about work, relationships, and lifestyles, where patterns that erode capacity are often rejected, not through reasoning alone, but through a felt sense that something is unsustainable. And this sense emerges directly from the exposed body's constant forecasting of future states based on present signals. And when forecasts predict depletion, discomfort increases, urging modification before damage occurs. And this urging is gentle at first, growing stronger only when ignored, because the goal is always correction rather than punishment. And this principle scales upward into how humans design environments and routines, seeking to embed opportunities for adjustment into daily life through breaks, transitions, and variability that allow regulation to reset incrementally rather than requiring drastic recovery later. And this design impulse reflects deep biological wisdom rather than conscious planning, because it mirrors the same strategies that allow the body to function without fur by distributing effort and recovery across time. Reinforce the central lesson, carried quietly through every era, that survival without insulation depends not on eliminating exposure, but on staying responsive to it continuously. And this responsiveness remains the foundation upon which human experience is built, shaping how the organism perceives stability, uncertainty, effort, and rest, while always orienting behavior toward the simple imperative of remaining capable of the next adjustment, the next step, and the next moment of balance, without ever assuming that balance once found will persist unless it is actively maintained again. This constant responsiveness remained embedded. It gradually influenced how humans interpret progress, because progress stopped being defined by sudden breakthroughs and instead became recognizable as the maintenance of forward motion without breakdown. And this subtle definition explains why humans often feel more satisfied by steady improvement than by dramatic leaps that leave them depleted afterward, since the exposed body measures success by whether it can continue tomorrow with integrity intact. And this measurement operates, quietly shaping motivation in ways that are difficult to override through intention alone. And this quiet metric also explains why setbacks that preserve capacity are often tolerated better than gains that compromise it, because the body understands that endurance depends on what remains possible rather than what was achieved once. And this understanding feeds into how humans manage expectations across time, adjusting goals when conditions change, not out of resignation but out of realism, because realism preserves agency, while denial increases exposure, and exposure without preparation leads to collapse. And this sensitivity to preparation reshaped how humans relate to beginnings, because beginnings became less about enthusiasm and more about calibration, where early phases are used to test limits, gather feedback, and establish rhythm before committing fully. And this cautious approach is not hesitation but reconnaissance carried out by an organism that cannot afford to commit blindly. And this pattern repeats across endeavors, physical, cognitive, and social, because all demand energy, generate heat and recovery, and therefore all must be regulated to remain sustainable. And this regulation becomes increasingly important as commitments accumulate, because accumulation narrows margins and increases the cost of error, which encourages strategies that preserve slack and avoid saturation. And this preference for slack appears counterintuitive in cultures that valorize maximum utilization, but it aligns precisely with the needs of an exposed body that must retain room to adjust when conditions shift unexpectedly, lost by creating behavioral margin rather than biological padding. And this margin allows correction to occur without abrupt withdrawal, which keeps continuity intact. And continuity is the substrate upon which learning occurs, because learning requires repetition under slightly varied conditions rather than one-time extremes. And as learning accumulates, it further improves regulation, creating a positive feedback loop where experience reduces exposure by improving anticipation, and anticipation reduces strain by enabling earlier adjustment. And this loop is fragile, however, because it depends on playstare, feedback remaining legible, and when environments obscure. Feedback through constant comfort, abstraction, or acceleration. The loop weakens, causing the body to revert to more conservative strategies, such as slowing, narrowing, focus, and avoiding novelty. Not because novelty is undesirable, but because legibility is compromised, and without legibility, regulation cannot function efficiently, and this inefficiency manifests as fatigue, dissatisfaction, or disengagement that are often misattributed to lack of motivation rather than loss of regulatory clarity. And restoring clarity does not require intensity. It requires conditions that reconnect effort with consequence in small, repeatable ways, allowing the body to re-establish trust in its ability to manage exposure. And once that trust returns, engagement follows naturally, because the exposed body prefers participation when participation feels manageable. And this preference explains why humans often gravitate toward environments that offer clear gradients and predictable responses, such as walking paths, workshops, or routines, where actions produce immediate, understandable effects. And this gravitation is not aesthetic, is regulatory, because clear cause and effect allow the nervous system to forecast accurately, and forecasting reduces vigilance, which conserves energy, and conserved energy supports endurance, and endurance remains the core advantage secured. When fur was lost, and this advantage continues to organize, experience subtly directing attention toward processes that sustain function over time, rather than peaks that threaten it. And as this orientation persists, it ensures that human behavior remains anchored to the same foundational logic that once governed survival under heat, namely that movement must be continuous effort, must be adjustable, and balance must be recreated again and again through awareness, pacing, and restraint, rather than assumed as a permanent condition. Because constant responsiveness remained embedded in the human, body progress gradually stopped being defined by sudden breakthroughs, and instead became recognizable through the ability to maintain forward motion without breakdown. And this quiet definition explains why steady improvement often feels more satisfying than dramatic leaps that leave the body depleted afterward, since an exposed organism measures success by whether it can continue tomorrow with its capacity intact, rather than by what was achieved in a single moment. And this internal metric operates beneath conscious intention, shaping motivation in ways that are difficult to override, because it is rooted in physiological forecasting rather than abstract goals. Over time, this forecasting encourages humans to tolerate setbacks that preserve function more easily than gains that compromise it, because what matters most is not the peak reached but the range that remains available afterward. And this perspective feeds directly into how expectations are managed across changing conditions, where goals are adjusted not out of resignation but out of realism, since realism preserves agency while denial increases. Exposure without preparation leads to collapse. In practice, this sensitivity reshaped how humans approach beginnings, because beginnings became phases of calibration rather than explosions of effort, where early stages are used to test limits, gather feedback, and establish rhythm before commitment deepens. And this approach is not hesitation, but reconnaissance performed by a body that cannot afford blind investment, and the same pattern repeats across physical, cognitive, and social domains, because all forms of engagement generate demand, consume energy, and require recovery. Therefore, all must be regulated to remain sustainable as commitments accumulate, margins narrow, and the cost of error rises, which encourages strategies that preserve slack rather than maximize utilization. And although slack is often misinterpreted as inefficiency, it functions as a behavioral substitute for the insulation that was lost by maintaining room to adjust when conditions shift unexpectedly. And this room allows correction without abrupt withdrawal, preserving continuity. And continuity is the substrate upon which learning depends, because learning requires repetition under slightly varied conditions rather than one-time extremes as experience. Accumulates anticipation, improves, and anticipation reduces exposure by enabling earlier adjustment, creating a feedback loop where regulation becomes more efficient rather than more effortful. Entirely on feedback, remaining legible, and when environments obscure feedback through constant comfort, abstraction, or acceleration, the loop weakens, causing the body to adopt conservative strategies, such as slowing, narrowing focus, or avoiding novelty. Not because novelty is undesirable, but because clarity has been reduced, and without clarity, regulation becomes inefficient, manifesting as fatigue, dissatisfaction, or disengagement that are often mistaken for lack of motivation rather than loss of regulatory coherence. Restoring coherence does not require intensity. It requires conditions that reconnect effort with consequence in small, repeatable ways, allowing the nervous system to trust that it can manage what follows, and once that trust returns, engagement follows naturally because the exposed body prefers participation when participation feels governable, and this preference explains why humans gravitate toward environments with clear gradients, predictable responses, and visible cause and effect, not for aesthetic reasons, but because these conditions support accurate forecasting, and accurate forecasting reduces vigilance, conserving energy that sustains endurance, and endurance remains the core advantage secured when fur was lost, an advantage that continues to organize experience by quietly directing attention toward processes that preserve function over time rather than peaks that threaten it. Orientation persists because balance is never assumed to be permanent, but must be recreated repeatedly through awareness, pacing, and restraint as conditions change and the body continues moving forward without interruption. Over long spans, this orientation toward recreating balance rather than reaching final states began to shape how humans perceive identity itself, because identity stopped being anchored in fixed attributes and became tied instead to patterns of behavior that could be sustained across changing conditions. And this shift matters because an exposed body cannot rely on static traits for long, since strength, speed, and resilience fluctuate with heat, fatigue, age, and context. And what remains reliable is not what the body is at any single moment, but how it responds when conditions drift out of range, and this responsiveness becomes the true marker of capability, shaping self-perception in ways that are subtle but persistent, where people come to recognize themselves through habits of adjustment, pacing, and recovery, rather than through isolated performances. And this recognition feeds back into behavior-reinforcing choices that protect continuity, even when those choices appear less impressive on the surface, because the body quietly prioritizes what allows it to remain functional tomorrow over what looks decisive today. And this priority is not consciously chosen. It emerges from the same forecasting systems that evolved to manage exposure when fur was lost, and these systems continue to evaluate actions by projecting their effects forward across time, asking not whether an action is possible, but whether it is repeatable without cost. And this evaluation influences how humans relate to effort under uncertainty, because uncertainty that unfolds gradually allows recalibration, while uncertainty that arrives abruptly threatens to overwhelm regulation. And so, strategies that slow the rate of change become appealing, not as avoidance, but as a way to keep the system within manageable bounds. And this preference becomes especially clear when humans face complex environments, where multiple variables interact simultaneously, because complexity increases the chance of unforeseen feedback. And unforeseen feedback under exposure increases risk. And to counter this risk, the body narrows focus, simplifies tasks, and seeks stable reference points that anchor adjustment. And these reference points can be physical, such as terrain, rhythm, or temperature, or social, such as shared routines, roles, and expectations. But in every case, they serve the same function of restoring legibility to the environment so that the body can predict how effort will translate into sensation and recovery. And this restoration of legibility is deeply regulating because it allows vigilance to soften without shutting down, enabling sustained engagement rather than withdrawal. It explains why humans often feel relief when systems become simpler, even if they require more effort. Because effort with clear feedback is easier to regulate than ease with obscured consequences. Assumptions about comfort suggesting that comfort alone does not produce calm unless it is paired with understanding of how that comfort is maintained. And when comfort appears disconnected from effort, the exposed body remains alert, unsure whether balance is genuine or temporary. And this uncertainty drains energy quietly over time, contributing to a sense of unease that persists, even in safe conditions. And resolving this unease does not require eliminating comfort, but reconnecting it to processes the body can track so that regulation becomes visible again, and this reconnection can occur through small acts of engagement, movement variation, or deliberate pacing that reintroduce feedback loops without overwhelming the system. And when these loops resume, the body settles not because danger has vanished, but because it has regained the ability to adjust if danger arises. And this regained ability is the foundation of confidence for an organism that cannot carry its protection internally, and therefore must rely on its capacity to respond rather than on guarantees. And this reliance continues to shape how humans approach relationships, work, and environments, favoring arrangements that allow gradual change, shared regulation, and recoverable error, over those that demand constant escalation or tolerate no deviation, because recoverability is essential when insulation is gone and error carries lasting consequences. And this logic persists quietly beneath conscious values guiding preferences, in ways that often feel intuitive rather than reasoned, because they are grounded in physiological history rather than abstract belief. And as long as the human body remains structured around heat dissipation, endurance, and exposure, it will continue to orient experience toward maintaining this delicate balance, choosing paths that preserve the ability to adapt over those that promise finality or certainty, since certainty was never something the exposed body could afford to trust. Moving forward not by seeking permanent solutions, but by cultivating the skills and conditions that allow balance to be recreated again under whatever circumstances arise next. Over time, this continual recreation of balance also reshaped how humans experience motivation, because motivation stopped being driven primarily by anticipation of reward and became tied instead to the feeling that effort could be carried forward without jeopardizing future capacity. And this distinction matters because an exposed body does not evaluate motivation by intensity, but by sustainability, and actions that threaten sustainability quickly lose their appeal, regardless of promised outcomes, while actions that support continuity generate a quiet pull that does not rely on excitement, and this pull often feels like inclination rather than desire, because it emerges from bodily forecasting systems that assess whether engagement will remain manageable across time. And when forecasting is favorable, the body leans in; when it is not, the body resists, even if the mind insists. And this tension between bodily resistance and cognitive intention is a common human experience that reflects the underlying logic of an organism adapted to endure rather than to peak. And this logic also explains why humans frequently lose motivation in environments where effort feels endless yet disconnected from recovery, because the body cannot locate a point at which balance will be restored, and without a foreseeable restoration, motivation erodes, since continuing would mean accumulating strain without resolution. And this erosion is not laziness, but protective withdrawal that preserves capacity by preventing further depletion. And this mechanism becomes especially visible in long-term projects or roles where demands escalate gradually without corresponding increases in recovery, because gradual escalation is harder to detect and correct than sudden overload, and the exposed body responds by reducing engagement subtly through distraction, fatigue, or disengagement, rather than by dramatic refusal, because subtle reduction maintains continuity while limiting further damage. And this response often confuses modern systems that expect consistent output regardless of conditions. But from a physiological perspective, it represents an faster, intelligent adaptation that favors survival over compliance, and this adaptation also influences how humans respond to pressure from others, because pressure that ignores regulatory signals is perceived as threatening not to identity or autonomy, but to continuity itself. And this perception triggers resistance, even when the pressure is framed positively, because The body recognizes that pushing beyond manageable limits risks collapse, and collapse undermines everything that follows. And so humans often negotiate expectations, adjust commitments, or seek alternative paths, not out of avoidance but out of a deeply ingrained need to preserve the ability to keep going. And this negotiation extends into social dynamics, where cooperation becomes more effective than coercion, because cooperation allows load sharing, pacing, and recovery, while coercion concentrates strain and increases the likelihood of breakdown. And this difference has profound implications for how groups function over time, because groups that respect regulatory limits tend to persist, while those that rely on constant escalation burn through capacity quickly. And this pattern repeats across scales, from small teams to entire societies, because the same exposed bodies underpin all human systems, and those bodies respond predictably to sustained misalignment by narrowing margins, withdrawing engagement, and eventually failing. And this predictability explains why resilience at the collective level depends less on intensity or speed and more on the ability to modulate demands, distribute effort, and allow recovery, because these factors directly support the regulatory needs of exposed organisms. And as societies grow more complex, the challenge becomes maintaining legibility of cause and effect, so that individuals can anticipate how their efforts will translate into outcomes and recovery. And when legibility is lost, motivation falters, not because people do not care, but because the body cannot see a path that preserves continuity. Restoring legibility often requires slowing processes, simplifying structures, or reintroducing feedback loops that allow adjustment to occur before strain accumulates too far. And this restoration mirrors the same strategies that allowed early humans to manage exposure under heat, by reading conditions, pacing movement, and adjusting early. And these strategies remain effective because the underlying constraints have not changed, and the body still evaluates actions by their impact on future capacity, regardless of context. And this evaluation quietly governs choices, shaping behavior in ways that appear personal, cultural, or moral, but are in fact grounded in a shared physiological history, where losing fur forced survival to depend on regulation rather than insulation. And as long as that history remains embodied, motivation will continue to flow toward paths that feel sustainable, away from those that threaten to consume the very capacity needed to continue. And this flow will persist beneath conscious narratives, guiding engagement toward continuity, adjustment, and recoverable effort, rather than toward final victories or irreversible commitments that the exposed body cannot afford to make. With this dependence on sustainment shaping motivation, it also influenced how humans interpret effort in relation to meaning, because meaning ceased to be something granted by completion and became something felt while the system remained coherent. And this coherence arises when effort, demand, and recovery align closely enough that the body can anticipate its own future without uncertainty. And when anticipation is possible, the nervous system relaxes into engagement, rather than bracing against collapse. And this relaxation supports attention, curiosity, and persistence without requiring excitement or urgency. And this state often feels subtle, easily overlooked, yet deeply stabilizing, because it signals that regulation is holding, and that holding can be repeated again tomorrow. And this is why humans often report a sense of rightness during activities that are neither easy nor overwhelming, but balanced enough to allow steady adjustment, because such activities mirror the conditions under which the exposed body originally thrived, maintaining movement under heat through continuous feedback, rather than through insulation or force. And this mirroring reinforces the sense that effort is justified, not by reward, but by its compatibility with future capacity. And as this compatibility becomes central, humans develop a sensitivity to situations where effort appears productive, yet quietly undermines recovery, because the body detects that the current pattern cannot be reenacted without cost, and this detection manifests as resistance, hesitation, or loss of interest, even when external incentives remain strong. And these responses are frequently misinterpreted as psychological issues, when, in fact, they represent accurate physiological forecasts, warning that the path ahead narrows rather than opens. And this forecasting ability is one of the most refined outcomes of losing fur, because it allowed early humans to avoid committing to actions that would end movement prematurely, and it continues to operate now, evaluating choices across domains that no longer involve physical heat, but still involve energy expenditure, stress, and recovery. And this continuity explains why modern humans often experience exhaustion not after intense effort, but after prolonged misalignment where demands persist without clear intervals for recalibration, because misalignment forces the body to remain vigilant without resolution, and vigilance consumes energy quietly without producing the satisfaction that comes from successful regulation, and over time, this quiet drain accumulates into fatigue that is difficult to address through rest alone, since rest does not restore orientation, and orientation is required for regulation to resume effectively, and restoring orientation often requires re-establishing sequences where action leads to predictable sensation and predictable sensation leads to recovery, allowing the body to close loops that have remained open. And this closure is essential for endurance, because open loops keep the nervous system active, searching for confirmation that balance is possible, and without confirmation, it cannot fully disengage or re-engage, and this liminal state becomes increasingly costly as complexity rises, because complexity multiplies variables that must be tracked, and when tracking exceeds capacity, the body responds by simplifying, narrowing focus, and avoiding additional inputs, not because it rejects complexity, but because it needs to reduce uncertainty to remain functional. And this simplification often feels like withdrawal or loss of interest from the outside. Yet from within, it represents an attempt to preserve continuity by preventing overload. This preservation impulse extends into how humans manage commitments over time, because commitments that allow renegotiation, pacing, and shared load remain viable, while those that demand constant escalation erode capacity and are eventually abandoned regardless of their apparent importance. And this pattern reveals that endurance-based organisms value flexibility not as an ideal, but as a survival requirement, because flexibility allows correction before collapse, and collapse remains the ultimate cost when insulation is absent. And as this logic permeates behavior, it shapes cultures, systems, and norms that favor maintainability over maximal output, even when such preferences conflict with narratives of efficiency or growth, because the body's priority remains unchanged to stay capable of the next adjustment and the next step and the next response without interruption. And this priority does not seek permanence or certainty, because permanence was never available. Once fur was lost, it seeks instead repeatability, the ability to recreate balance again under new conditions. And this seeking continues quietly guiding choices, perceptions, and reactions across modern life, because beneath every abstraction, the same exposed body remains, generating heat, consuming energy, and forecasting the future based on whether what it is doing now will allow it to continue without crossing thresholds that would once have ended movement entirely and still signal the need to change course before the cost becomes unrecoverable. With punctuation restored, the flow of thought does not need to stop. It only becomes easier to breathe. This same exposed body that learned to forecast heat and fatigue also learned to read consequence in advance of outcome, and that ability quietly reshaped how humans experience choice. A choice is never evaluated only by what it promises, but by what it will demand afterward. The body asks whether recovery is possible, whether adjustment remains available, whether the next step can still be taken without forcing a break. This question runs beneath awareness, shaping decisions long before reasons are articulated. It is why some paths feel wrong, even when they look optimal, and why others feel right despite appearing slower or less impressive. Because insulation was lost, choice became inseparable from consequence. There is no buffer that erases error overnight. Fatigue carries forward. Strain leaves residue. This continuity teaches the body to treat every action as part of a chain rather than an isolated event. Chains can be managed if links are strong and spaced correctly, but they fail if tension concentrates in one place for too long. Humans learned this not through philosophy, but through repeated exposure to limits that could not be crossed twice. Over time, this chain-based awareness reshaped how humans relate to pressure. Pressure that rises gradually allows calibration. Pressure that spikes suddenly overwhelms regulation. An exposed body therefore reacts more strongly to rapid escalation than to high but stable demand. This is why sudden deadlines, abrupt changes, and unpredictable surges often feel more draining than sustained effort of equal magnitude. The issue is not effort itself, it is the loss of time to adjust. Time is the true resource once fur is gone, because time allows heat to dissipate, energy to be rationed, and recovery to be planned. This dependence on time explains why humans value pacing so deeply, even when they claim to value speed. Speed without pacing collapses into exhaustion. Pacing preserves motion. It keeps the body within a range where correction remains possible. This preference shows up everywhere, in how people break tasks into stages, how they schedule rest, how they prefer gradual learning over sudden immersion. These are not habits of comfort. They are strategies that keep an exposed system from saturating. As environments grew more complex, this logic did not disappear. It adapted. Physical heat became cognitive load. Distance became duration. Yet the same regulatory principles apply. When demand outpaces recovery, strain accumulates. When vigilance persists without resolution, fatigue follows. The body responds in the only way it knows, by narrowing focus, reducing engagement, and seeking conditions where adjustment can resume. This response is often mislabeled as avoidance or lack of discipline. In reality, it is a protective contraction that preserves future capacity. An exposed organism cannot afford to spend everything now. It must hold something back for what comes next. This is why humans often resist total commitment without exit paths, why they prefer options that allow renegotiation, and why they feel uneasy in systems that tolerate no error. Error, once insulation is gone, is never free. It must be paid for later. Gradually, this payment logic shaped how humans experience trust. Trust is not blind confidence. It is confidence that correction will be allowed when needed. A system, a relationship, or a role feels safe when it permits adjustment before damage becomes irreversible. When adjustment is blocked, the body reacts with tension regardless of assurances. This reaction is not emotional fragility. It is regulatory intelligence. The body is assessing whether it can stay inside its limits without being trapped. This same intelligence shapes how humans approach rest. Rest is not simply the absence of activity. It is the process by which balance is restored and margins are rebuilt. Rest that follows effort is effective because it closes a loop. Rest that occurs without effort leaves the loop open and the body remains alert. This is why inactivity does not always feel restful, and why moderate exertion often improves sleep. The exposed body relaxes when it can see the cycle complete. All of this returns to the same origin, without repetition for its own sake. Losing fur did not just change temperature regulation. It reorganized life around continuity, adjustability, and recoverability. It made time visible. It made consequence persistent. It made balance something that must be recreated rather than assumed. And because the body still operates under these constraints, it continues to guide behavior quietly, steering humans toward ways of living that keep the chain intact, the margins open, and the possibility of the next adjustment alive. From this perspective, even modern concepts like productivity and efficiency take on a different meaning. Productivity is not simply the amount produced in a given span of time, but the degree to which output can be sustained without degrading the system that produces it. The exposed body understands this intuitively. It does not measure success by peaks, but by whether those peaks leave enough capacity for what follows. When productivity ignores recovery, it borrows against the future, and the body registers that debt immediately as tension, resistance, or fatigue. Efficiency, too, is reinterpreted. An action that looks efficient in isolation may be inefficient for an exposed organism if it compresses effort into a window too narrow to regulate. Shortcuts that increase speed but remove feedback feel risky because they reduce the opportunity to adjust. The body prefers paths that may appear slower but allow continuous correction. This is why humans often redesign systems not to eliminate effort, but to distribute it more evenly. Even when technology accelerates processes, people instinctively insert pauses, stages, and checkpoints. These are not bureaucratic accidents, they are regulatory necessities. As this logic extends into everyday life, It reshapes how humans relate to obligation. Obligations that acknowledge limits and allow renegotiation are tolerable, even motivating. Obligations that deny limits and demand constant escalation provoke strain and eventual withdrawal. The body does not rebel against obligation itself. It rebels against obligation that threatens continuity. This distinction explains why commitment can feel stabilizing in some contexts and suffocating in others. Stability emerges when commitment includes room for adjustment. Suffocation emerges when adjustment is forbidden. This sensitivity also alters how humans perceive freedom. Freedom is not the absence of structure. For an exposed body, total lack of structure increases uncertainty and therefore exposure. True freedom is the presence of structures that support regulation, allowing choice within safe bounds. This is why routines can feel liberating rather than restrictive, and why chaos often feels exhausting rather than exciting over time. The body relaxes when it knows how effort will be met and how recovery will occur. Even creativity follows this pattern. Creativity does not flourish under constant pressure without recovery. It requires cycles of engagement and release, focus, and diffusion. These cycles mirror the physical rhythms that once governed movement under heat. When creative effort is pushed without pause, the body treats it like any other unsustainable demand. Insight narrows. Flexibility decreases. What looks like a mental block is often regulatory overload. Restore rhythm, and creativity returns. This continuity between physical regulation and cognitive function is not metaphorical. Thought consumes energy. Attention generates heat. Emotional processing alters breathing and muscle tone. The exposed body regulates all of it, using the same principles that once managed long walks across open terrain. When any domain exceeds capacity without relief, the whole system responds. There is no separation between body and mind here, only different expressions of the same constraints. Over generations, these constraints shaped a species that values processes over endpoints, pacing over bursts, and adaptability over rigidity. These values appear in ethics, economics, and art, not because they were invented intellectually, but because they worked biologically. They allowed exposed bodies to persist where insulated bodies could not. They reduced catastrophic failure at the cost of dramatic peaks. They favored continuity over conquest. What makes this history difficult to notice is that it never announces itself. It operates quietly, through preferences that feel personal and reactions that feel intuitive. Discomfort arises before explanation. Relief arrives when regulation is restored, even if nothing obvious has changed. The body is responding to alignment, not narrative. And so, beneath every modern abstraction, the same ancient logic continues its work. Heat must be managed, whether physical or cognitive. Effort must be paced, whether muscular or emotional. Recovery must be protected, whether through sleep, rest, or simple disengagement. None of this is optional for an organism that chose endurance over insulation. The loss of fur was not a single adaptation among many. It was a commitment to a way of existing where survival depends on staying responsive rather than protected, on adjusting rather than enduring blindly. That commitment still defines the human condition, not as a limitation, but as the quiet structure that makes long continuation possible in a world that never stops changing. Even the way humans relate to failure becomes intelligible. Failure is rarely experienced as a single event. It is felt as a signal that regulation has slipped beyond what can be corrected easily. The discomfort associated with failure is not primarily shame or disappointment, but the recognition that future capacity has been reduced. An exposed body reacts strongly to this realization because every reduction in capacity narrows the margin for the next adjustment. This is why people often feel compelled to recover, reorganize, or withdraw after failure, rather than immediately try again. The body is not avoiding effort. It is restoring the conditions that make effort viable. This restorative impulse also explains why reflection follows strain. Reflection is not always cognitive analysis. It is often a bodily pause in which signals are integrated and limits are reassessed. When insulation is gone, experience must be processed, because unprocessed strain carries forward. The body seeks coherence between what happened and what can happen next. Without that coherence, action feels unsafe. With it, movement resumes naturally. Over time, this need for coherence shaped how humans experience learning. Learning that improves regulation is retained. Learning that adds complexity without improving adjustment is resisted. Skills that allow effort to be distributed more evenly, mistakes to be corrected earlier, or recovery to occur more reliably feel valuable even when they offer no immediate reward. This is why humans often invest deeply in techniques, rituals, and practices that appear inefficient to outside observers. Their value lies not in speed, but in stability. They keep the system readable. The same logic governs how humans respond to uncertainty. Uncertainty that preserves time for adjustment is tolerable. Uncertainty that compresses response time is not. This is why ambiguity is often easier to live with than sudden change. Ambiguity allows monitoring. Sudden change demands immediate reaction. For an exposed body, immediate reaction carries risk because it bypasses the gradual calibration that keeps heat and effort within bounds. The preference for predictability, then, is not fear of the unknown, but a preference for unknowns that unfold slowly enough to be managed. As societies expanded, this biological preference scaled into structures that emphasize buffering through time rather than through insulation. Storage, scheduling, division of labor, and redundancy all serve the same function. They create room to adjust. They slow the rate at which error becomes catastrophe. They replace biological protection with temporal protection. This substitution is subtle but profound. Humans do not make the world softer. They make it slower where it matters. This slowing does not mean stagnation. It enables persistence. A system that moves too fast for regulation collapses. A system that allows adjustment survives. The exposed body learned this lesson first. Human systems inherited it later. When systems violate it, strain appears across populations in predictable ways. Fatigue, disengagement, brittleness, and eventual breakdown. These outcomes are often treated as moral or motivational problems, but they are regulatory ones. The body is signaling that the rate of demand exceeds the rate of adjustment. Even rest itself is shaped by this understanding. Rest is effective when it restores margin. It is ineffective when it merely interrupts activity without restoring coherence. This is why shallow rest leaves people tired, while purposeful recovery renews them. The body needs to feel that balance has been re-established and can be recreated again. What emerges from all of this is not a story of fragility, but of precision. Losing fur did not weaken humans. It forced them to become exact. Exact about timing, exact about pacing, exact about limits. This exactness is what made long survival possible under conditions that defeated stronger, faster, and better protected animals. It remains the hidden architecture of human behavior, operating beneath culture and technology. The exposed body still lives by the same rules. It still generates heat. It still accumulates strain. It still requires recovery. And it still prefers paths that allow adjustment before collapse. Every modern experience that aligns with these rules feels strangely right. Every experience that violates them feels draining, no matter how impressive it appears. This is not coincidence. It is continuity. What follows from this irreversible shift is a subtle but profound change in how humans experience stability. Stability is no longer something the body assumes. It is something the body tests continuously. Each action becomes a probe. Each sensation, a report. The exposed organism lives in a state of ongoing verification, constantly checking whether the current configuration of effort, environment, and internal state can be sustained. When the answer is yes, tension eases. When the answer is uncertain, alertness rises. This process runs quietly beneath conscious thought, yet it shapes almost every choice. Because insulation was lost, stability stopped being static. It became dynamic. A fur-covered animal can remain still and protected for long periods without consequence. A human body cannot. Stillness without shelter leads to heat loss or dehydration. Motion without pacing leads to overheating. Stability, therefore, emerges only when conditions are actively balanced. This makes human calm fundamentally different from animal rest. Calm is not the absence of movement or demand. It is the successful management of both. This distinction explains why humans often feel unsettled in environments that appear perfectly safe but provide no clear feedback. When temperature, light, and effort are flattened into constants, the body receives fewer signals confirming that regulation is occurring. Safety becomes abstract rather than embodied. The nervous system remains partially engaged, waiting for confirmation that never arrives. In contrast, environments that require gentle adjustment, changing light, variable terrain, modest exertion, provide continuous confirmation. The body knows what it is doing and why. Calm follows, not because conditions are easier, but because they are legible. Legibility becomes a central requirement once fur is gone. The exposed body must be able to read its situation accurately to remain within limits. This need for legibility shapes how humans structure activities, spaces, and even narratives. Clear sequences, visible progress, and predictable transitions reduce uncertainty and preserve capacity. Confusion, ambiguity, and sudden shifts increase exposure by compressing response time. The body reacts to these not as intellectual problems, but as physiological threats. Over time, this preference for legibility influences how humans interpret complexity. Complexity itself is not the problem. Unreadable complexity is. Systems that are complex but transparent can be regulated. Systems that are simple but opaque cannot. This is why people often tolerate demanding routines while resisting unclear ones. Demand can be paced, opacity cannot. The exposed body needs to see how effort translates into outcome and recovery. When that translation is hidden, strain accumulates. The same principle governs how humans relate to time. Time is not merely duration, it is space for adjustment. Sufficient time allows heat to dissipate, errors to be corrected, and recovery to be planned. Insufficient time forces abrupt decisions that bypass regulation. This is why time pressure is so physiologically costly. It removes the buffer that insulation once provided. Without fur, time becomes the primary margin of safety. Losing time feels dangerous because it reduces the opportunity to adjust before thresholds are crossed. This is also why humans instinctively resist environments that accelerate continuously without pause. Acceleration narrows margins. It reduces foresight. It increases the likelihood that small misalignments will become irreversible. The body responds by tightening, simplifying, and eventually withdrawing. These responses are often interpreted as resistance to change, but they are better understood as attempts to preserve the capacity to continue. All of these reactions trace back to the same biological reality. Once fur was lost, survival required continuous alignment between internal state and external condition. Alignment replaced protection. Regulation replaced buffering. The body became exacting not by choice, but by necessity. And that exactness still governs how humans experience comfort, effort, clarity, and strain today, even when the original environmental pressures are no longer visible. This exacting requirement for alignment also reshaped how humans experience responsibility, not as a moral abstraction, but as a bodily reality. Responsibility emerges when actions carry forward consequences that cannot be easily erased. An exposed body learns this quickly. Overexertion today reduces capacity tomorrow. Poor timing today narrows options later. Because insulation no longer absorbs error, responsibility becomes continuous rather than episodic. The body does not wait for judgment. It registers consequence directly. This directness trains humans to think in chains rather than moments, to sense how present choices shape future states long before those states arrive. From this perspective, discipline is not self-denial. Discipline allows effort to be distributed rather than concentrated, preserving margin where adjustment remains possible. This is why discipline often feels calming rather than restrictive once it is established. The nervous system relaxes when it knows that strain will be contained and recovery protected. Chaos, even when exciting, keeps the system alert because outcomes cannot be forecast reliably. For an exposed body, uncertainty without room to adjust is costly. This also clarifies why humans develop such a strong sensitivity to excess. Excess heat, excess effort, excess stimulation, excess obligation all share the same effect. They overwhelm regulatory capacity. Excess is not defined by quantity alone, but by the speed at which demand accumulates. Slow accumulation allows correction. Rapid accumulation does not. Fur would have softened this distinction. Humans lost that softening, and in doing so became acutely aware of thresholds. Threshold awareness influences how humans perceive fairness as well. Fairness is not only about equal outcomes, it is about equal exposure. Situations where one individual carries disproportionate strain threaten group continuity, because collapse in one place can cascade. This is why humans often react strongly to systems that concentrate pressure, even when those systems appear efficient. The reaction is not ideological at first. It is physiological. An exposed body recognizes when margins are being eroded unevenly. As this recognition spread across groups, humans learn to externalize regulation into shared practices. Rotations of labor, shared rest periods, and mutual support emerged not as ethical ideals but as survival strategies. These practices allow recovery to occur without halting collective activity. They mirror the same logic that governs pacing within a single body. Scaled outward, where insulation once localized stress, exposure requires distribution. This distribution extends into how humans manage knowledge. Knowledge that reduces exposure is preserved. Knowledge that increases strain without improving regulation fades. Over generations, this selection shapes traditions, tools, and customs that appear cultural but function biologically. They slow processes, clarify sequences, and create buffers through time rather than through insulation. They make survival legible. Even modern systems, when they function well, unknowingly follow these principles. They build redundancy, allow pauses, and create feedback loops that reveal when strain is rising. When they fail, they do so by accelerating beyond regulatory capacity, hiding consequences until collapse occurs. The exposed body reacts to these failures long before collapse is visible, through fatigue, disengagement, and loss of trust. These reactions are often dismissed as subjective, yet they are precise indicators of systemic misalignment. At the individual level, this same logic explains why humans often seek meaning through contribution rather than accumulation. Contribution engages regulation. It requires pacing, responsiveness, and adjustment. Accumulation without engagement does not. The body feels the difference. Meaning arises when effort fits within a sustainable pattern that can be reenacted. It fades when effort feels extractive, leaving less capacity afterward than before. All of this reinforces a simple but demanding truth. Once fur was lost, humans could no longer rely on passive protection. They had to become experts in managing conditions. That expertise did not take the form of dominance or force. It took the form of timing, restraint, and shared regulation. These qualities continue to guide behavior quietly, shaping how humans respond to pressure, organize effort, and decide when to continue and when to change course. Always with the same underlying aim of staying within limits long enough for the next adjustment to be made and the next phase of movement to remain possible. This continuous management of limits also altered how humans relate to authority and guidance. Authority that recognizes biological limits feels stabilizing, while authority that ignores them feels threatening. The difference is not ideological, but physiological. An exposed body responds positively to structures that help regulate effort, and negatively to those that demand output without regard for recovery. This is why leadership that paces demands, allows feedback, and adjusts expectations tends to preserve engagement over time, while leadership that accelerates relentlessly produces short bursts of compliance followed by exhaustion and withdrawal. The body understands when it is being guided within safe margins and when it is being driven beyond them. Guidance becomes effective when it extends the body's ability to forecast. Clear expectations, visible timelines, and predictable consequences reduce uncertainty and therefore reduce exposure. When guidance is inconsistent or opaque, the body cannot anticipate what is coming next. Vigilance increases, energy drains, trust erodes. None of this requires conscious reasoning. The exposed organism reacts automatically to the quality of regulation offered by its environment. This sensitivity explains why humans often seek mentors, routines, and frameworks during periods of high demand. These structures are not crutches. They are regulatory aids. They restore legibility when complexity rises. They slow the rate of change enough for adjustment to occur. In doing so, They replace the insulation that biology no longer provides. The same logic applies to how humans experience safety. Safety is not the absence of threat, but the presence of adjustment capacity. An environment can be objectively safe yet feel unsafe if it allows no room to respond when conditions change. Conversely, environments that contain manageable challenges often feel safer because they train regulation continuously. The body trusts what it can adjust to. It distrusts what it cannot. Over time, this trust in adjustability reshaped how humans approach risk. Risk that allows learning is accepted. Risk that threatens irreversible loss is avoided. This distinction explains why humans willingly engage in difficult activities that offer clear feedback, while avoiding situations that appear benign but obscure consequences. The exposed body values recoverable error. It fears traps, not challenges. As these patterns stabilized, they influenced how humans experience belonging. Belonging is not only emotional attachment, it is shared regulation. A group feels safe when its rhythms allow individuals to stay within limits together. When group demands exceed individual capacity, belonging fractures. The body signals this through stress, long before social bonds dissolve. Cooperation works because it distributes exposure. Isolation magnifies it. This is why humans often feel relief in coordinated activity, even when it is demanding. Shared pace reduces uncertainty. Shared rest restores margin. The body relaxes when regulation is not carried alone. This relief is physical as much as emotional, rooted in the same logic that once made group movement across open terrain safer than solitary travel. At a deeper level, all of these responses point to a fundamental shift in what it means to be adapted. Adaptation is not a fixed trait. It is a process that must be enacted repeatedly. An exposed body is never simply adapted. It is always adapting. Each day requires renewed alignment. Each context requires recalibration. This ongoing requirement prevents stagnation but also prevents complacency. Because of this, humans rarely feel permanently settled. Even in stable conditions, there is an undercurrent of adjustment. The body continues to scan, test, and correct. This is not anxiety by default. It is readiness inherited from a time when stopping regulation meant stopping movement, and stopping movement often meant death. Modern life often masks this readiness with comfort and abstraction, but it does not remove it. When signals weaken, the body compensates by increasing vigilance. When feedback disappears, fatigue rises. When adjustment is blocked, resistance emerges. These reactions are not flaws. They are the natural expressions of an organism that chose endurance over insulation. The loss of fur did not simplify life. It made life exacting. It demanded continuous participation in one's own survival. That demand still echoes through every system humans build and every pattern they follow, guiding behavior toward forms of engagement that preserve adjustability, protect recovery, and maintain the fragile but powerful ability to continue without collapse as conditions shift and the next moment of balance must be found again. This demand for continuous participation also reshaped how humans experience effort in relation to dignity. Dignity is not derived from effortless existence, but from the ability to meet demands without being broken by them. An exposed body recognizes dignity when it can engage fully and still recover, when effort leaves it intact rather than depleted. This is why work that exhausts without restoring feels degrading, even if it is rewarded, while work that challenges yet preserves capacity often feels meaningful regardless of status. The body is registering whether its regulatory integrity is being respected. From this standpoint, exploitation becomes visible not only as injustice, but as forced misalignment. When demands consistently exceed the capacity for adjustment, the body enters a state of chronic strain. Chronic strain does not announce itself dramatically. It dulls perception, narrows curiosity, and erodes motivation. Over time, it reduces resilience, making even small challenges feel overwhelming. These effects are often mistaken for personal weakness, yet they are predictable outcomes of sustained exposure without adequate recovery. This understanding reframes why humans place such value on boundaries. Boundaries are not merely psychological constructs. They are physiological necessities. They mark the limits within which regulation remains possible. When boundaries are respected, the body can engage deeply. When they are violated repeatedly, the body withdraws to protect what capacity remains. This withdrawal is not refusal, it is conservation. The same logic applies to how humans relate to time off, breaks, and pauses. These are not indulgences. They are intervals in which regulatory systems reset and margins are rebuilt. Without them, alignment degrades. With them, effort becomes repeatable. This repeatability is the cornerstone of endurance. It allows contribution to persist without collapse. As societies advanced, these biological realities were often translated into moral language. Rest became a virtue or a vice. Discipline became praised or condemned. Yet beneath these narratives, the body continued to respond according to the same rules. When moral systems aligned with regulation, they flourished. When they demanded denial of limits, they produced strain and eventual reform. History repeatedly demonstrates this cycle, not because humans fail to learn, but because biological constraints cannot be legislated away. Even ambition is shaped by this constraint. Ambition that ignores recovery burns out. Ambition that integrates pacing endures. This is why long-term achievements are rarely the result of constant maximal effort. They emerge from cycles of engagement and renewal that preserve capacity across years. The exposed body rewards those cycles with sustained motivation and clarity. It punishes their absence with fatigue and disengagement. This pattern extends into how humans relate to conflict. Conflict that escalates rapidly, overwhelms regulation, and leads to breakdown. Conflict that unfolds gradually allows adjustment, negotiation, and repair. The body responds differently to each. Rapid escalation triggers defensive contraction. Gradual tension invites problem solving. This difference explains why dialogue feels possible in some disputes and impossible in others, independent of the issues involved. At the deepest level, all these responses trace back to a single irreversible shift. When fur was lost, survival stopped being something the body could handle alone. It became something that had to be managed continuously through awareness, timing, and restraint. The body did not become weaker. It became accountable to its own limits. That accountability still governs human experience today. It shapes why people seek balance rather than extremes, why they value clarity over speed, why they resist systems that demand everything at once, and why they feel relief when conditions allow adjustment. These reactions are not signs of fragility. They are expressions of a finely tuned organism that learned, long ago, that the ability to continue matters more than any single moment of triumph. In this sense, the loss of fur was not merely a physical change, it was a redefinition of what survival meant. Survival became a practice rather than a state, something enacted again and again through choices that preserve capacity and allow life to move forward without collapse, even as conditions shift and certainty remains forever out of reach. This practice of survival as something enacted repeatedly also reshaped how humans relate to hope. Hope is often imagined as belief in a favorable outcome, but for an exposed body, hope is quieter and more practical. It is the sense that adjustment remains possible. When hope exists, the body continues to engage because it believes that effort can still be brought back into balance. When hope disappears, what vanishes is not optimism, but the expectation that recovery or correction will be allowed. In those moments, withdrawal is not despair, it is conservation. This distinction explains why humans can endure difficult conditions for long periods when they can see a path for recalibration, even if that path is narrow. Harsh environments, demanding work, or prolonged uncertainty are tolerated when they unfold in ways that allow pacing and recovery. By contrast, relatively mild conditions become unbearable when they are rigid, opaque, or inescapable, because the body senses that adjustment has been removed. Once adjustment is blocked, endurance loses its foundation. This sensitivity also shapes how humans experience justice. Justice is not only about fairness of outcome, but about fairness of strain. When strain is distributed in a way that allows everyone to remain functional, systems feel just even if they are demanding. When strain is concentrated, hidden, or denied, injustice is felt viscerally before it is articulated. The exposed body recognizes when margins are being eroded unevenly, because collapse in one place threatens continuity everywhere. Over time, this visceral recognition influenced how humans constructed norms and expectations around care. Care is not simply compassion, It is the maintenance of regulatory capacity in others. To care for someone is to notice when their margins are narrowing and to intervene before collapse occurs. This intervention might take the form of rest, support, or redistribution of effort. These practices are often framed morally, but their origin lies in the practical necessity of keeping exposed bodies viable within shared systems. This is also why humans often experience guilt when they ignore their own limits or the limits of others. Guilt arises not only from violating rules, but from sensing that regulation has been compromised. It is a signal that continuity has been threatened unnecessarily. In this way, emotional responses become extensions of physiological forecasting, guiding behavior back toward conditions that preserve capacity. As environments became increasingly mediated, the challenge shifted from managing physical heat to managing informational and emotional load. Yet the same principles apply. Cognitive overload functions like thermal overload. Emotional saturation mirrors dehydration. Without clear intervals for recovery, strain accumulates invisibly. The exposed body responds with the same strategies it always has: narrowing focus, slowing engagement, and seeking legible patterns that restore predictability. This continuity reveals why modern fatigue often feels confusing. People may not be physically exhausted, yet they feel unable to continue. The body is responding not to muscle depletion, but to regulatory overload. Too many variables change too quickly. Too little feedback confirms adjustment. The ancient systems that once managed movement under heat now struggle to manage abstraction without rhythm. When rhythm is restored, even briefly, energy returns. All of this points to a central truth that remains easy to miss. Human strength does not lie in resistance to limits, but in responsiveness to them. The loss of fur forced this responsiveness to become precise, constant, and unavoidable. It demanded attention not as a virtue, but as a requirement. Attention keeps the body inside survivable ranges. That requirement did not end when climates changed or technologies advanced. It persists in every domain where effort meets consequence. Whenever humans feel relief after slowing down, clarity after structuring effort, or motivation after restoring rhythm, they are experiencing the same regulatory success that once allowed their ancestors to keep moving across open landscapes under the sun. The story, then, is not one of loss followed by compensation, but of transformation. Fur was exchanged for a way of living that depends on awareness rather than protection. The body became exposed, and in doing so, it became exacting. That exactness still governs human life quietly, shaping how people work, rest, relate, and hope, always orienting them toward the same enduring goal: to remain capable of the next adjustment, the next response, the next continuation, even when the future cannot be made safe, only manageable. To keep this exactness intact, it helps to see how all these threads converge on a single constraint rather than branching endlessly. The constraint is simple. Once insulation disappeared, the body could no longer tolerate unmanaged accumulation. Heat, fatigue, strain, and error all had to be handled as they arose. Nothing could be stored indefinitely without consequence. This constraint compresses complexity instead of expanding it. It forces every system, biological or social, to answer the same question repeatedly. Can this be sustained without closing off future adjustment? From that question follows a specific logic of action. Actions are favored when they preserve optionality. Optionality is not indecision. It is the capacity to change course without collapse. An exposed body survives by keeping options open, because closed paths increase exposure. Once an option is closed, recovery becomes harder, timing becomes tighter, and margins shrink. This is why humans instinctively resist irreversible commitments that demand constant output. The resistance is not fear of responsibility. It is sensitivity to the loss of adjustability. This sensitivity explains why humans often value redundancy, even when it appears inefficient. Redundancy creates slack. Slack creates time. Time allows correction. Fur once provided slack by buffering temperature and injury. After its loss, slack had to be created behaviorally. Extra supplies, alternative routes, backup plans, shared roles, these are not signs of weakness. They are structural replacements for insulation. They slow failure. They turn abrupt collapse into gradual strain that can be addressed. The same logic applies to why humans dislike systems that appear optimized to the edge. Edge optimization leaves no room for error. In insulated organisms, this might be tolerable. In exposed ones, it is dangerous. When everything is pushed to maximum efficiency, there is no space to dissipate heat, absorb mistakes, or recover from deviation. Tension rises not because the system is demanding, but because it is brittle. This brittleness is the opposite of endurance. Endurance depends on resilience, and resilience depends on recoverability. Recoverability depends on margin. Margin is therefore not excess. It is necessity. This is why humans often rebuild systems after failure, by reintroducing buffers rather than doubling down on speed. The lesson is learned repeatedly because it is enforced repeatedly by biology. Importantly, this does not mean humans avoid challenge. It means they select challenges that allow feedback and adaptation. Challenges with clear gradients can be climbed. Challenges that present cliffs cannot. The exposed body prefers slopes, not because slopes are easy, but because they allow adjustment mid-ascent. This preference explains why gradual difficulty increases are more effective than sudden intensity, why training works better when load is progressive, and why learning sticks when complexity is layered rather than dumped. This logic also constrains how far abstraction can go before it breaks alignment. Abstraction removes sensory feedback. Without feedback, regulation weakens. When regulation weakens, vigilance increases. When vigilance persists, fatigue accumulates. The system then compensates by seeking concrete anchors, routines, rituals, physical movement, or clear structure. These anchors are not nostalgic retreats. They are regulatory resets. They reconnect action to consequence in a way the body can read. Seen this way, many modern struggles are not about motivation or discipline, but about misalignment between demand and regulatory capacity. When people slow down, simplify, or withdraw, they are not failing to adapt. They are adapting in the only way an exposed organism can when margins disappear. They are attempting to reopen space for adjustment. All of this keeps the story tightly bound to its origin. Humans lost fur to manage heat during sustained activity. That loss removed passive protection. In response, survival reorganized around timing, pacing, margin, and recovery. These principles did not remain confined to physiology. They scaled upward into behavior, cooperation, systems, and values. They continue to operate now, quietly enforcing the same constraint. Nothing that accumulates without management can be sustained. As long as the human body remains structured around heat dissipation rather than insulation, this constraint does not loosen. It does not care about intention, ideology, or technology. It simply asks, again and again, whether the next step leaves room to adjust. When the answer is yes, movement continues. When the answer is no, the body signals the need to change course. That signal is not noise. It is the core mechanism that replaced fur, and it still governs what can last and what cannot. This insistence on leaving room to adjust also clarifies why humans react so strongly to environments that deny reversibility. Irreversible systems collapse options into a single path, and a single path under exposure is always dangerous. Once committed, the body senses that any miscalculation will compound rather than dissipate. Stress rises not because the task is hard, but because exit routes are blocked. An exposed organism survives by keeping exits visible, not by avoiding effort. This is why people often feel calmer working harder when they know they can stop, pause, or revise, and more anxious doing less when they cannot. The presence of an exit preserves regulation. Its absence accelerates strain. This preference reshapes how humans interpret risk-taking. Risk is acceptable when losses are bounded and learning is possible. Risk becomes intolerable when losses cascade. Bounded risk allows the body to test limits without threatening continuity. Cascading risk threatens collapse. The distinction is physiological before it is rational. It explains why humans willingly take on difficult challenges with clear feedback, while avoiding seemingly small commitments that can spiral uncontrollably. The body recognizes which risks preserve margin and which erase it. Margin also explains why humans evolved such sensitivity to early indicators. Subtle cues, slight fatigue, reduced clarity, irritability, are treated seriously because they forecast narrowing options. These cues are often dismissed culturally as weakness or negativity, yet biologically they are precise instruments. They arrive early because early action is cheaper. Fur once delayed consequence, now the body must not. Early signals are how the organism buys time. Ignoring them converts manageable strain into irreversible cost. Over long periods, this early warning orientation shapes how humans plan. Planning is not an attempt to control outcomes. It is an attempt to protect adjustability. Plans that include contingencies reduce exposure. Plans that assume perfect execution increase it. This is why humans tend to distrust rigid plans, even when they look elegant. Elegance without flexibility is brittle. The body responds to brittleness with tension because it knows that correction will be expensive or impossible once deviation occurs. This logic also constrains how much optimization humans can tolerate. Optimization that removes slack improves short-term output but undermines long-term viability. The exposed body senses this trade immediately. When systems are optimized to the edge, any deviation becomes catastrophic. Stress rises because the cost of error is no longer absorbable. Humans therefore repeatedly rebuild slack after failures, even when doing so appears inefficient. Slack is not waste. It is the medium through which recovery operates. Recovery itself deserves precision here. Recovery is not simply rest, and it is not always inactivity. Recovery is the restoration of margin. Sometimes margin is restored by sleep, sometimes by movement that dissipates accumulated load, sometimes by simplification that reduces variables. The body knows which form is required by reading what has been depleted. When recovery restores margin, confidence returns. When it does not, rest feels hollow and effort remains aversive. This margin-based understanding also explains why humans struggle in environments that constantly promise optimization without acknowledging recovery. When demands escalate, while recovery is postponed indefinitely, the body predicts a future where margin approaches zero. Motivation collapses because the forecast is negative. This collapse is not a moral failure. It is accurate risk assessment by an organism that cannot survive without adjustability. All of these responses keep circling back to the same origin without drifting. Humans lost fur to manage heat during sustained activity. That choice eliminated passive buffering. To compensate, survival reorganized around preserving margin through timing, pacing, redundancy, and early correction. These principles are not optional preferences layered onto culture. They are enforced by the body every time it evaluates whether an action can be repeated without damage, because repetition is the true test of viability. Anything that can be done once but not again is a liability for an endurance-based organism. Anything that can be done again and again with small adjustments becomes reliable. Reliability, not intensity, is what allowed humans to persist. That persistence required systems that slow failure, reveal feedback early, and keep exits open. As this logic continues to scale upward, it shapes how humans judge institutions, relationships, and lifestyles. Those that erase it feel oppressive. Regardless of intent, this judgment happens quietly, often before reasons are articulated, because it is grounded in bodily forecasting rather than ideology. The body asks the same question it has always asked since fur was lost. Will this leave room to adjust, or will it close the path ahead and force collapse if anything goes wrong? This question about whether a path remains open continues to govern how humans evaluate commitment at every scale. Commitment that preserves adjustability feels stabilizing, while commitment that locks the future into a single narrow channel feels threatening. The difference is subtle but decisive. An exposed body can tolerate sustained effort if it knows that recalibration remains possible. It cannot tolerate effort that demands blind continuation regardless of changing conditions. This is why humans often negotiate terms, timelines, and boundaries before fully engaging. They are not resisting responsibility. They are ensuring that regulation can continue once engagement begins. This logic also explains why humans respond poorly to environments that treat breakdown as acceptable collateral. When failure is normalized without mechanisms for recovery, the body interprets participation as unsafe. Stress rises, not because people fear failing, but because they fear being unable to recover afterward. Recovery is the currency of endurance. Without it, effort becomes extraction. The exposed body withdraws from extraction instinctively. Over time, this sensitivity shaped how humans experience trust. Trust is built not by promises of protection, but by demonstrated recoverability. Systems that show they can absorb error without collapse earn trust. Systems that punish error harshly or unpredictably erode it. This response is not ideological. It is biological. An exposed organism cannot afford to stay inside systems that turn small mistakes into irreversible losses. It must seek contexts where correction is possible. This is why transparency matters so deeply to humans, even when outcomes are unfavorable. Transparency preserves legibility. Legibility preserves regulation. When processes are visible, the body can anticipate strain and prepare recovery. When processes are hidden, vigilance spikes because forecasting becomes impossible. The exposed body responds to opacity as it would to sudden environmental shifts, by tightening margins and conserving energy. Engagement falls not because people do not care, but because they cannot safely invest. The same principle governs how humans experience autonomy. Autonomy is not the absence of constraint. It is the presence of choice under constraint. An exposed body does not seek limitless freedom. It seeks the ability to adjust when signals demand it. Autonomy that allows adjustment supports engagement. Autonomy that exists only in name while locking outcomes undermines it. The body recognizes the difference immediately. As these biological preferences accumulate, they quietly shape culture. Cultures that emphasize pacing, shared load, and recoverability tend to persist. Cultures that valorize constant escalation and irreversible commitment tend to burn through capacity. This is not because one set of values is morally superior, but because one aligns with the constraints of an exposed organism and the other ignores them. Over time, alignment wins by attrition. Importantly, none of this eliminates ambition or innovation. It channels them. Innovation that increases adjustability spreads. Innovation that increases brittleness fails. Tools that reduce uncertainty and expand margin endure. Tools that compress feedback and accelerate consequence create short-lived gains followed by long-term strain. This pattern repeats across history because it is enforced by bodies, not by ideas. Even pleasure follows this rule. Pleasure that integrates into sustainable patterns enhances life. Pleasure that disrupts regulation erodes it. The body distinguishes between the two not by moral judgment, but by how each affects future capacity. This is why some pleasures leave people refreshed and others leave them depleted. The difference lies in whether margin was preserved. All of this keeps the narrative anchored. Humans lost fur to manage heat during sustained movement. That loss removed passive protection and made survival contingent on active regulation. Regulation required time, margin, feedback, and adjustability. Those requirements scaled outward into behavior, cooperation, and systems. They remain operative now, even when the original environmental pressures are no longer obvious. The result is a species that does not thrive by pushing blindly forward, but by maintaining the ability to correct course. Strength expresses itself as continuity. Intelligence expresses itself as anticipation. Care expresses itself as preservation of margin. These expressions can look slow or cautious from the outside, but they are the only forms compatible with an exposed body that must keep moving without collapsing. So the question the body asks has never changed. It is not whether something can be achieved, but whether it can be achieved again without breaking what makes achievement possible. When the answer is yes, engagement deepens. When the answer is no, resistance appears. It is the legacy of a decision made long ago, when humans traded fur for endurance and accepted a life where survival depends on keeping paths open, margins intact, and the future adjustable enough to take the next step without crossing a point of no return. This legacy also explains why humans rarely feel satisfied by systems that promise final solutions. Finality removes the need for adjustment, and for an exposed body that absence feels unnatural rather than comforting. Once fur was gone, life no longer resolved into safe end states. It became a sequence of temporary balances, each one maintained only as long as conditions allowed. The body learned that stability is provisional and that assuming permanence invites error. As a result, humans tend to trust processes more than conclusions. They are reassured not by guarantees, but by the presence of mechanisms that can respond when guarantees fail. This preference subtly alters how humans experience confidence. Confidence is not the belief that nothing will go wrong. It is the belief that something can be done when it does. The exposed body values this form of confidence because it preserves motion. Confidence based on certainty collapses when certainty breaks. This distinction explains why people often feel calmer in difficult situations they know how to navigate than in easy situations they do not understand. Understanding restores the ability to respond. Over time, this orientation reshaped how humans approach complexity. Complexity that reveals its structure can be managed. Complexity that hides its structure cannot. The body reacts differently to each. Visible structure allows prediction. Prediction allows pacing. Pacing preserves margin. Hidden structure forces guesswork. Guesswork accelerates exposure. This is why humans are drawn to maps, models, and explanations, even when those explanations do not change outcomes. They change legibility, and legibility restores regulation. The same applies to uncertainty about the self. Humans often seek narratives that explain who they are and what they are doing, not merely for identity, but for regulation. A coherent narrative links effort to consequence across time. It allows the body to anticipate its own future and allocate energy accordingly. When narratives fracture, regulation weakens. The body feels lost not because it lacks meaning, but because it lacks orientation. Orientation is the prerequisite for endurance. This need for orientation also shapes how humans relate to change. Change that preserves reference points is tolerable. Change that removes them is destabilizing. The exposed body does not resist change per se. It resists disorientation. When reference points disappear, adjustment becomes guesswork. Guesswork increases risk. This is why transitions are easier when they include continuity, familiar rhythms, retained skills, recognizable roles. These elements anchor regulation while new patterns form. As environments accelerate, this anchoring becomes more important rather than less. Speed compresses feedback. Compression reduces correction time. Reduced correction time increases the cost of error. The body responds by slowing internally, even if externally it is pushed to go faster. This internal slowing manifests as hesitation, fatigue, or disengagement. These reactions are often framed as resistance to progress, but they are protective responses to compressed adjustability. This perspective reframes many modern tensions. When people push back against relentless optimization, they are not rejecting improvement, they are rejecting brittleness. When they seek balance, they are not avoiding effort, they are preserving the capacity to continue. When they disengage from systems that promise growth without recovery, they are not apathetic. They are responding accurately to forecasts of collapse. Throughout all of this, the original constraint remains intact. Without fur, the body cannot afford unmanaged accumulation. Heat, fatigue, stress, and error must be dissipated or redistributed. If they are not, the system fails. This constraint applies whether the accumulation is physical, cognitive, emotional, or social. That is why the same patterns reappear across domains. Pacing in movement becomes pacing in work. Recovery after exertion becomes recovery after stress. Shared load in travel becomes shared responsibility in groups. Margin in physiology becomes slack in systems. None of these are metaphors. They are direct translations of a survival strategy that began with the loss of insulation and expanded outward. The human body still enforces this strategy quietly. It rewards environments that allow adjustment with energy and engagement. It punishes environments that deny it with fatigue and withdrawal. These responses are not conscious decisions. They are the output of regulatory systems that evolved to keep an exposed organism alive under conditions where failure to adjust meant collapse. And because those systems remain unchanged at their core, they continue to shape what feels livable and what does not. Anything that removes it feels oppressive. This feeling arrives before explanation, before ideology, before language. It is the body answering the same question it has answered since fur was lost. Does this path leave room to adjust, or does it narrow until movement becomes impossible if anything goes wrong? This narrowing toward the end of the argument does not mean resolving it, but exposing its full reach. What began as a thermal problem never stayed thermal. Once insulation was gone, every domain of life became subject to the same rule. Accumulation without release leads to failure. That rule is simple, but its consequences are vast. It governs how bodies move, how groups organize, how systems endure, and how individuals judge what feels possible or impossible long before they can explain why. At this stage, it becomes clear that many tensions humans experience are not contradictions, but mismatches between biological constraint and external design. Systems often promise limitless growth, constant acceleration, or permanent solutions, yet the body continues to operate within limits that cannot be negotiated away. When those promises collide with reality, strain appears. It is clarity arriving in bodily form. The exposed organism is signaling that the proposed pattern cannot be repeated without damage. This is why humans repeatedly rebuild what they have already learned. They push toward extremes, experience collapse, then reintroduce margin. They accelerate, burn out, then slow down. They centralize pressure, watch failure spread, then redistribute load. This cycle is not cultural amnesia. It is the enforcement of a constraint that does not weaken with time. The body does not remember ideas. It remembers consequences. Each collapse reinforces the same lesson. Endurance requires adjustability. The persistence of this lesson explains why even highly advanced environments still rely on basic regulatory practices. Sleep remains non-negotiable. Movement remains restorative. Social support remains protective. These are not relics of a primitive past. They are active requirements for an exposed organism managing accumulation across time. No amount of abstraction removes the need to dissipate heat, resolve strain, or restore margin. What often changes is how these needs are disguised. Physical exhaustion becomes mental fatigue. Environmental heat becomes cognitive overload. Dehydration becomes emotional depletion. Yet the body responds the same way. When accumulation outpaces release, regulation falters. When regulation falters, engagement declines. When engagement declines, systems interpret the signal incorrectly and often respond by increasing pressure, which accelerates failure rather than correcting it. Understanding this dynamic reframes many human struggles. Burnout is not lack of resilience, it is evidence of sustained misalignment. Disengagement is not apathy, it is withdrawal to preserve what remains. Resistance is not irrational, it is early detection of narrowing margins. These responses are not signs that something is wrong with people. They are signs that something is wrong with the pattern people are being asked to sustain. At the individual level, this recognition can be disorienting because it challenges narratives of unlimited potential. Humans are capable of extraordinary endurance, but only under conditions that allow regulation to function. It is conditional. It expands when margin exists and contracts when it does not. The exposed body knows this, even when ideology denies it. That knowledge surfaces as intuition, discomfort, or sudden loss of motivation when boundaries are crossed. At the collective level, the same principle determines which systems persist. Systems that incorporate recovery survive. Systems that deny it collapse or must be rebuilt. This is true regardless of scale or intent. No amount of moral framing or technological sophistication can override the need for margin. The exposed body enforces this rule relentlessly, because the cost of ignoring it was once death and remains breakdown. Seen from this angle, the loss of fur was not an isolated evolutionary event. It was a commitment to a life governed by feedback. Without insulation, the body became transparent to consequence. Nothing could be hidden for long. Errors surfaced quickly. Recovery had to be planned. Cooperation became necessary. Attention became survival. This transparency increased vulnerability, but it also increased precision. Humans became exacting because they had to be. That exactness still operates quietly beneath modern life. It is why people feel relief when complexity simplifies, why they sleep better after effort than after stagnation, why they trust systems that allow correction and distrust those that demand perfection, why they sense when a path is unsustainable even if they cannot articulate the reason. These sensations are not mystical. They are regulatory outputs from a body designed to manage accumulation without insulation. As the argument approaches its final stretch, the shape of the answer becomes unavoidable. Humans lost their fur not to become weaker, but to remain active under heat. That adaptation removed passive protection and forced survival to depend on active regulation. Regulation required pacing, margin, early warning, and recovery. Those requirements did not fade. They expanded outward, shaping behavior, cooperation, and systems across time. The result is a species that cannot thrive through domination alone. It must negotiate with limits. It must listen to feedback. It must preserve the ability to adjust. This does not make humans fragile. It makes them conditional. Their strength exists only as long as the conditions that support regulation are maintained. When those conditions disappear, strength becomes irrelevant. What remains, then, is not a neat conclusion but a recognition. The human body is still exposed. It still accumulates. It still requires release. Every structure that ignores this will eventually fail, and every structure that respects it will feel, in some quiet way, livable. This feeling is not preference. It is alignment, and alignment is the true legacy of losing fur. It is the reason humans continue to seek balance rather than certainty, process rather than finality, and continuation rather than conquest. The body does not ask whether something is impressive. It asks whether it can be lived with again tomorrow. When the answer is yes, life moves forward. When the answer is no, something must change, because once insulation was gone, there was no longer any room for pretending otherwise. The ending does not arrive as a revelation, because nothing here was hidden. It arrives as recognition. The human body has been telling this story continuously, long before language existed. When fur was lost, survival stopped being something that happened automatically. It became something that had to be managed, moment by moment, through attention, timing, and restraint. That requirement never ended. It only changed form. What looks like restlessness, burnout, resistance, or dissatisfaction in modern life is often the same signal expressed in new conditions. It is the body responding to patterns that cannot be repeated without damage. It is the exposed organism announcing that accumulation has exceeded release, that margins have narrowed too far, that adjustment has been delayed too long. These signals are not failures of will. They are expressions of the same regulatory intelligence that once prevented collapse under heat. The mistake humans repeatedly make is to treat these signals as obstacles to overcome rather than information to read. Overcoming them works briefly. Ignoring them works until it does not. The body is patient, but it is exact. It will always enforce the same rule. What cannot be regulated cannot be sustained. This rule applies regardless of era, culture, or technology. It applies to work, relationships, systems, and identities just as it once applied to movement across open land. Understanding this does not lead to retreat or weakness. It leads to clarity. Clarity about why certain paths feel right, even when they are demanding, and why others feel wrong, even when they promise ease. Clarity about why pacing restores energy while acceleration drains it. Clarity about why shared load strengthens groups while concentrated pressure fractures them. None of this is accidental. It is the direct consequence of living without insulation. The human body never adapted to eliminate limits. It adapted to read them early enough to respond. That responsiveness is not caution for its own sake. It is what makes endurance possible. Endurance is not stubborn persistence. It is the ability to continue without destroying the conditions that allow continuation. Once fur was gone, endurance became the only viable form of strength. This is why humans do not truly seek comfort, even when they claim to. They seek manageability. They seek conditions where effort leads to recovery, where feedback arrives in time, where error can be corrected, and where the future remains open. Comfort without these qualities feels hollow. Difficulty with them feels meaningful. The body knows the difference, because its survival once depended on recognizing it correctly. Nothing in modern life cancels this inheritance. Climate control does not remove the need for recovery. Automation does not remove the need for pacing. Abstraction does not remove the need for legibility. The form of accumulation changes, but accumulation itself does not disappear. Heat becomes cognitive load. Distance becomes duration. Dehydration becomes emotional depletion. The regulatory logic remains the same. So the final answer is not a sentence, but a lens. Humans lost their fur to stay active under heat. That loss removed passive protection and made survival conditional on active regulation. Everything that followed, attention, pacing, cooperation, systems, values, exists to support that condition. When life aligns with it, humans feel capable, engaged, and alive. When life violates it, they feel drained, resistant, and lost. The body is not asking for perfection. It is asking for adjustability. It is not asking for certainty. It is asking for time. It is asking that effort leave something intact for what comes next. These requests are not negotiable because they are written into the structure of an exposed organism that chose endurance over insulation, and that choice still governs what can last. When a path preserves margin, allows correction, when a path demands everything now and offers nothing later, the body will eventually refuse, no matter how convincing the story sounds. This refusal is not failure. It is fidelity to a deeper logic. The loss of fur did not make humans vulnerable by accident. It made them precise on purpose. And precision, not protection, is what has carried them forward ever since.